Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Sleepless Dossier, the only place where history keeps you up at night. Today we're pulling the curtain back on the architecture of fear itself. We're exploring the moment the world pivoted from a hot war of smoking cities to a cold war of silent betrayals and simmering paranoia. It was a global game of chicken, played with atomic bombs and counterfeit smiles, and the true history they don't want you to know is that it was all built on a series of carefully constructed lies. It's a labyrinthine story, full of shadows and whispers, and frankly, it's grim. The sheer scale of the deception is enough to give anyone a healthy dose of pessimism about human nature. Before we dive into the inevitable betrayals and double crosses, if you appreciate us digging up the facts that keep historians awake, please hit that like and subscribe. It ensures these secrets keep finding their way into the light. All right, dim the lights. This one gets messy. The official story begins in the ashes of 1945. The war is over. The great evil of Nazism has been vanquished, but victory parades barely mask the tectonic shifts happening beneath the surface. The United States, a reluctant giant now awakened, stands astride the world, its industrial heart pumping out the machinery of a new global order. The Soviet Union, bled white with 27 million dead, has nevertheless pushed its Red Army to the very heart of Europe. A vacuum exists, a terrifying power vacuum, and nature, as we know, abhors it. But the American public is exhausted. They want their boys home. They want normalcy. They have no stomach for another crusade, a permanent state of global vigilance, a vast and expensive military-industrial apparatus. These were not easy sells to a population that had just sacrificed everything for peace. A new enemy was required, not just an adversary, but a monolithic existential threat, an evil so profound it could justify eternal vigilance. Enter Winston Churchill. By March 1946, he is a man without a country to lead, voted out of office in a stunning electoral upset. He is a political ghost rattling the chains of a dying British Empire. But he is also the world's most famous orator, a living symbol of defiance. On March 5th, he travels to Westminster College in the small town of Fulton, Missouri, with President Harry S. Truman sitting right behind him on the stage, a deliberate, calculated endorsement. The speech he delivers is not history's post-mortem, it is its prologue. He speaks of a special relationship between the English-speaking peoples, a desperate plea from a bankrupt Britain for America to not abandon it. And then he delivers the line that would echo for half a century, the phrase that would become the foundational myth of the Cold War. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. It sounds like a passive observation, a lament. It was anything but. It was the most successful act of political framing in modern history. The image was brutal, simple, and terrifying. An impenetrable barrier of totalitarian darkness, dropped by an implacable foe. It wasn't just a description of the Soviet sphere of influence, it was a declaration of ideological warfare. Churchill wasn't reporting on the weather. He was seeding the clouds for a storm. He was giving the American political establishment the soundbite it so desperately needed to rally a war-weary public. He was painting the Soviets not as the bruised and paranoid allies they had just been, but as the new Nazis, an expansionist force bent on world domination. The reality, of course, was infinitely more complex. Stalin was a paranoid tyrant, yes, but he was also leading a nation in ruins, obsessed with creating a buffer zone against a third German invasion in a century. His actions were as much driven by deep-seated national fear as by ideological ambition. But that nuance was inconvenient. It couldn't justify a multi-trillion-dollar arms race. An iron curtain could. Consider this our first of many such documents tonight, a perspective you won't find in the public record. Classified memo. From the desk of a senior British Foreign Office planner, dispatched to Churchill's attaché, February 1946. Subject: on the framing of the Soviet problem for the American audience. Winston, the Americans are sentimentalists. They recoil from the necessities of balance of power politics. They require a moral narrative, a clear delineation between light and darkness. Describing the situation in Eastern Europe in terms of spheres of influence will be perceived as cynical realism. reminiscent of the old world they profess to disdain. It will not move them from their peacetime posture, however, framing the Soviet presence as a curtain, an unnatural, suffocating barrier to liberty, transforms a complex geopolitical reality into a simple, compelling morality play. It allows no room for negotiation or understanding. It demands confrontation. We are no longer asking them to secure British interests. We are inviting them to lead a crusade for freedom. They will find this invitation irresistible, and they did. The speech was a masterpiece of manufactured consent. It didn't just describe a division, it created one in the minds of millions. It gave birth to the Cold War mindset, a binary zero-sum game where any Soviet gain was a Western loss, where diplomacy was weakness, and where military strength was the only true currency. The long-term consequence was catastrophic. It locked two nuclear-armed powers into a 45-year standoff, a state of permanent simmering war that would burn hot in proxy conflicts across the globe, from the jungles of Southeast Asia to the mountains of Afghanistan. It justified intelligence agencies operating with impunity, black budgets that dwarfed the economies of small nations, and a culture of secrecy and paranoia that seeped into the very foundations of Western democracy. The Iron Curtain wasn't just a physical barrier of barbed wire and watchtowers. It was a psychological one, built in Fulton, Missouri, and it trapped everyone on both sides. That psychological barrier, that newly minted Iron Curtain, required reinforcement. A line drawn in rhetoric is fragile. It needs to be solidified with concrete and steel, or in this case with dollars and cents. By 1947, the situation in Europe was not improving. It was catastrophic. The continent was a landscape of rubble, hunger, and despair. Winters were brutal. Coal was scarce. Economies were shattered. And in this fertile ground of misery, communism was not just an ideology. It was a promise of order, of food, of a future, however grim. For Washington, the specter of Italy or France, nations with powerful communist parties voting themselves into the Soviet orbit was not a distant possibility. It was an imminent threat. The old world was dying, and something new was going to be born from its corpse. The question was, whose child would it be? The public narrative, the one taught in schools, is a story of American magnanimity. It's called the Marshall Plan. Officially, the European Recovery Program. Secretary of State George C. Marshall, a man whose stoic integrity made him the perfect face for the project, announced the plan in a commencement address at Harvard University in June 1947. He spoke of a duty to restore the normal economic health in the world, without which there can be no political stability and no assured peace. He framed it as a policy directed not against any country or doctrine but against hunger, poverty, desperation, and chaos. It was a beautiful speech, a noble sentiment. It was also one of the most sophisticated geopolitical deceptions of the 20th century. This was not charity. This was the second major offensive of the Cold War, a calculated act of economic warfare disguised as humanitarian aid. The true genius of the Marshall Plan lay not in what it did, but in the conditions attached. The United States offered billions, the equivalent of over $150 billion in today's money, to any European nation that wanted to rebuild. The catch? To receive the aid, nations had to agree to a program of economic integration. They had to open their books. They had to lower trade barriers. They had to orient their economies toward a free market, capitalist model, a model that would, by its very nature, become dependent on the colossal American industrial machine. It was a set of golden handcuffs. America wasn't just offering to rebuild Europe's factories. It was offering to rebuild them as branch offices of an American-led global economy. The plan was designed to create a unified capitalist Western European bloc, economically tethered to and politically aligned with the United States. It was a strategy to buy loyalty, to create a cordon sanitaire of prosperous, dependent allies who would stand as a bulwark against Soviet expansion. And here is the most cynical part of the gambit. The offer was extended to everyone, including the Soviet Union and its Eastern European satellites. The architects of the plan in the State Department knew, with absolute certainty, that Stalin would never accept. How could he? Accepting Marshall aid would require him to expose the rickety, shattered state of the Soviet economy to Western scrutiny. It would mean allowing American economic influence to permeate his newly acquired buffer states, undermining his iron grip. It would be tantamount to surrendering the economic sovereignty he had fought and killed millions to secure. He was trapped. To accept was to capitulate. To refuse was to be painted as the villain, the cruel tyrant who would rather let his people starve than accept the generosity of the West. It was a checkmate move on the geopolitical chessboard. When Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov walked out of the Paris Planning Conference, calling the plan an instrument of American imperialism, he was telling the truth. And in doing so, he handed Washington its greatest propaganda victory yet. He, not the Americans, appeared to be the one dividing Europe. He was the one lowering the curtain that Churchill had only a year prior so helpfully described. Uncomfortable. Quote, from the private diaries of a U.S. State Department policy planner, dated July 1947, we call it a recovery program, and in a sense it is. But it is the recovery of our own strategic footing. We are not feeding the hungry out of altruism. We are feeding them to keep them from turning to the bear. Every shipload of grain is a bullet in the ideological war. Every new tractor is a nail in the coffin of European communism. We presented Molotov with an offer he couldn't accept but couldn't afford to refuse. His rejection is the cornerstone upon which we will now build the Western Alliance. We did not create the division of Europe. We simply made it economically irreversible. We have created a dollar curtain, and it will prove far more durable than any iron one. The long-term consequence of this weaponized generosity was the permanent economic partitioning of the world. The Marshall Plan worked brilliantly. Western Europe was rebuilt, its economies boomed, and the threat of communist takeovers receded. But it created a world of dependencies. The dollar became the global reserve currency, giving the United States unparalleled leverage over the world economy. The World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, instruments of this new order, ensured that the rules of global finance would be written in Washington. For the Soviet Union, the plan was a disaster. It forced them to double down on their own exploitative economic model in Eastern Europe, creating the grim, inefficient Comecon bloc in response. It locked them into an economic arms race they could never hope to win, forced to compete against the combined industrial might of the United States and a revitalized Western Europe. The Marshall Plan wasn't just a recovery program. It was the moment America stopped pretending the goal was peace and started playing to win the Cold War, not with bombs, but with banks. The dollar curtain, as it turned out, needed a military guard. An economic division is an abstraction until men with guns are sent to patrol it. The first test of this new, hard-edged reality would not come in the corridors of power in Paris or London, but in the ruins of the old Nazi capital, Berlin. The city was a geopolitical absurdity, a schizophrenic remnant of the Grand Alliance. It was carved into 4 sectors: American, British, French, and Soviet. But it was located 110 miles inside the Soviet occupation zone of East Germany, a democratic island in a communist sea. It was a splinter in the Soviet paw, a listening post, a propaganda beacon, and an escape hatch for those fleeing the new order in the East. For Stalin, it was an intolerable provocation. He believed the West's presence there was temporary. He was about to test that belief. In early 1948, the Western powers, flush with the success of the Marshall Plan, moved to create a new, unified currency in their zones of Germany, the Deutsche Mark. This was the first step toward creating a sovereign West German state, a move Stalin saw, not incorrectly, as a direct threat. His response was crude, but logical. On June 24, 1948, Soviet forces blockaded all rail, road, and canal access to West Berlin. The electricity from the Soviet sector was cut off. 2.5 million people were effectively stranded, hostages in their own city. Stalin's calculation was simple. He would starve them out. He believed the Western Allies had only 2 options. They could try to force an armored convoy through the blockade, an unambiguous act of war that a war-weary America would never stomach. Or the more likely option, they would capitulate, abandoning Berlin and accepting the humiliation. It was a classic gambit of power politics, a brutal squeeze play. The story we are all told is one of heroic defiance. The Berlin Airlift, or Die Luftbrücke, the air bridge. It is a tale of compassion, of brave Allied pilots flying around the clock in treacherous conditions, delivering food and fuel to a besieged populace. We see the black and white newsreels of smiling German children cheering as American C-54s, the candy bombers, drop chocolates and chewing gum on tiny parachutes. It is framed as one of the great humanitarian triumphs of the 20th century, a testament to the moral superiority and resolve of the free world. And it was, in its way, a triumph. But its primary purpose was not humanitarian. It was a calculated, brutal display of industrial and military power, a message aimed not at the grateful citizens of Berlin, but directly at the men in the Kremlin. The truth is, the West had other options. A full-scale evacuation of the civilian population was seriously discussed. But to evacuate Berlin would be to surrender it. It would have been a political catastrophe, proving that American security guarantees were worthless. It would have sent a signal of weakness across Europe, emboldening communist parties and terrifying potential allies. Berlin had to be held, not just for its people, but for what it represented. The airlift was chosen because it was the one option that was both non-military and profoundly intimidating. It was a logistical miracle designed to function as a psychological weapon. Every plane that landed at Tempelhof, Gatow, or Tegel was a flying billboard for American supremacy. The ceaseless roar of engines day and night was a symphony of industrial might. It was a demonstration that the same nation that had built 300,000 aircraft to defeat the Axis could now dedicate a fleet to supplying a single city, indefinitely. Classified memo from a Pentagon strategic air power analyst to General Lucius D. Clay, July 1948. Subject: the airlift as a strategic projection instrument. General: the public relations value of feeding the city is immense, and we should leverage it fully. However, the core strategic objective is the sustained demonstration of logistical capacity. The Soviets understand troop numbers and tank divisions. They do not fully comprehend what it means for us to move this volume of tonnage by air. Every ton of coal we deliver is a reminder of our ability to deliver other, less benign payloads with the same efficiency. The operation is a non-nuclear mushroom cloud of industrial might. We are not merely challenging a blockade, we are showcasing the very system that would prosecute a strategic bombing campaign against the USSR. Let them watch. Let their intelligence count the landings. Let them calculate the tonnage. The cost is high, but it is an investment in fear. We are teaching them that their conventional land-based superiority is irrelevant in the face of our airborne reach. The airlift was the single greatest marketing campaign for American power ever conceived. Over 15 months, American and British pilots flew over 250,000 missions, delivering more than 2.3 million tons of supplies. It was a staggering achievement that left the Soviets stunned. They could shoot down a plane and start World War III, or they could do nothing and watch their blockade become a symbol of their own impotence. In May 1949, they quietly lifted it. The crisis was over, but its consequences were permanent. The airlift transformed the West Germans from defeated enemies into devoted allies, forever grateful to their saviors. It provided the final, urgent impetus for the creation of NATO in April 1949. The blockade was the clear and present danger that made a formal military alliance not just prudent, but essential. And it sealed the division of Germany, leading directly to the founding of the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany, and the German Democratic Republic, East Germany. Stalin's attempt to excise the tumor of West Berlin from his empire had failed. Instead, it had metastasized, creating a formal, armed, and implacably anti-Soviet state on his doorstep. The airlift didn't just save a city, it built the central front of the Cold War. The roar of the airlift engines had barely faded when the architects of this new world gathered to sign the paperwork. On April 4, 1949, in Washington, D.C., the foreign ministers of 12 nations put their signatures to the North Atlantic Treaty. The ceremony was thick with solemn pronouncements about peace, liberty, and the defense of Western civilization. President Truman spoke of a neighborly act, a shield against aggression that would allow the people of Europe to rebuild their lives in security and confidence. The public language was all about defense. The key, the sacred text, was Article 5. An attack against one member shall be considered an attack against them all. It was presented as a simple reactive pact, a neighborhood watch for nations, a purely defensive alliance of democracies standing shoulder to shoulder against the looming threat of totalitarianism. This narrative is not so much a lie as it is a radically incomplete truth, a carefully cropped photograph that cuts out all the inconvenient details. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization was not a shield. It was a cage, brilliantly designed with three distinct functions, a tripartite purpose that was whispered in the chancelleries of Europe, but never spoken aloud to the public. Lord Ismay, NATO's first Secretary General, would later summarize it with a blunt, cynical clarity that cuts through decades of diplomatic cant. The purpose of NATO, he said, was to keep the Russians out, the Americans in, and the Germans down. That was the original sin of the alliance, the ugly, pragmatic truth buried beneath the soaring rhetoric of collective security. Keep the Russians out was the easy part. It was the public justification, the banner under which everyone could march. The Berlin blockade had been a gift to the treaty's planners, providing visceral proof of Soviet aggression. The memory of the Red Army's brutal consolidation of power in Eastern Europe, the Prague coup of 1948 being the final nail in that coffin, was fresh. The conventional military might of the Soviet Union was terrifying. It had millions of men under arms, thousands of tanks poised to roll across the North European plain. The shattered armies of France, Belgium, and the Netherlands were no match. Only the American nuclear monopoly held them in check, and no one knew how long that would last. So yes, part one of the mission was deterrence, to draw a hard line and declare to Moscow, this far and no further. Keep the Americans in was the far more desperate, unspoken European objective. For Britain and France, the two great and now fading imperial powers, the nightmare scenario was not just a Soviet invasion. It was a return to American isolationism. The United States had a long, cherished history of avoiding entangling alliances, of retreating behind its two vast oceans after a crisis was over. It had done so after World War I, with catastrophic results. European leaders were terrified that once Europe was stable, the Americans would simply pack up and go home, leaving them to face a resentful Germany and a brooding Soviet Union alone. The treaty was a trap for the United States, a permanent entanglement. Article 5 was a tripwire. By binding America's security to the security of Western Europe, it made it impossible for Washington to ever disengage. It institutionalized the American military presence on the continent, ensuring that the GIS who had arrived as liberators would stay on as protectors, guarantors, and, ultimately, as the quiet overlords of the Western Bloc. But it's the third function that reveals the deepest layer of cynicism: keep the Germans down. In 1949, the memory of German militarism was not a historical footnote. It was a raw, gaping wound. No one, least of all Germany's neighbors, trusted the Germans. The French were particularly paranoid about the prospect of a rearmed Germany, a nation that had invaded and humiliated them 3 times in 70 years. Yet the strategic reality was undeniable. To defend Western Europe against the Red Army required German manpower and German industry. It was a horrifying paradox. To be safe, Europe needed the very thing it feared most: a strong Germany. NATO was the solution. It allowed for the miracle of West German rearmament, but did so in a way that neutralized the threat. The new German army, the Bundeswehr, would be integrated into a NATO command structure. It would not have its own general staff in the old Prussian tradition. Its divisions would be commanded by an American Supreme Allied commander. It was rearmament on a leash, a way to use German strength without ever having to trust German intentions. Uncomfortable, quote, attributed to a senior French diplomat in a private conversation with his British counterpart, late 1948. We have 2 great fears: that the Soviet tanks will one day reach the English Channel, and that the German tanks will one day reach the English Channel. The first fear is acute, the second is chronic. This Atlantic Treaty is the only medicine that treats both diseases at once. It harnesses the American bull to our plow, which keeps the Russian bear out of our field. And by putting a German soldier back in uniform but giving him an American to salute, we ensure that the plow horse we are forced to use can never again become a war horse, that tramples the farmer. The long-term consequence of this arrangement was the formal, militarized division of the world into two hostile nuclear-armed camps. NATO was not just a response to the Cold War. It was the institution that would perpetuate it for 4 decades. Its existence necessitated an answer, which came in 1955 with the formation of the Warsaw Pact, a Soviet-dominated military alliance that was a mirror image of NATO's structure. The treaty locked American and Soviet forces into a permanent face-off in the heart of Europe. It justified a relentless arms race, pouring trillions of dollars into weapons of ever-increasing lethality. It created a vast, permanent military bureaucracy on both sides, generals, defense contractors, intelligence analysts, whose careers and budgets depended on the continuation of the conflict. It was the ultimate self-fulfilling prophecy. By creating an alliance to defend against a perceived threat, it made that threat real and the confrontation permanent. The cage designed to provide security became a prison for all of humanity, with the two superpowers as the wardens, each rattling the bars of the other's cell. With the creation of NATO, the battle lines in Europe were drawn in concrete. The West had its fortress, its tripwire, its American guarantor. There was a sense of grim stability, of a manageable, albeit terrifying, stalemate. But the world is not a European chessboard. On September 23, 1949, American atmospheric sensors detected the telltale radioactive isotopes of a nuclear fission event over the Soviet Union. The American nuclear monopoly was over, years ahead of schedule. The foundation of Western security had cracked, and just 8 days later, on October 1st, an event of even greater geopolitical magnitude unfolded. In Beijing, a man named Mao Zedong stood before a massive crowd in Tiananmen Square and proclaimed the founding of the People's Republic of China. The most populous nation on Earth, a quarter of the human race, had fallen to communism. For the American public, this was an incomprehensible shock, a strategic cataclysm on par with Pearl Harbor. China wasn't supposed to fall. It was America's project, its great Asian protege. For decades, American missionaries, businessmen, and diplomats had cultivated a paternalistic relationship with the country. During World War II, the U.S. had poured billions of dollars in aid and military support to the nationalist government of Chiang Kai-shek, propping him up as a great Christian leader and a bulwark against Japanese imperialism. The idea that this vast nation could simply be lost was not just a policy failure. It was a profound blow to the American sense of destiny and power. The question, immediately weaponized by political opportunists in Washington, began to echo through the halls of Congress and onto the front pages of newspapers. Who lost China? The question itself was a masterpiece of political deception. It presumed that China was America's to lose in the first place. The reality on the ground, a reality that had been meticulously documented by American diplomats in the field, was that Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist regime, the Kuomintang, had lost China all by itself. It was breathtakingly corrupt, militarily incompetent, and had alienated the vast peasant population through a combination of brutal conscription, hyperinflation that wiped out savings, and a complete failure to enact meaningful land reform. American aid vanished into the pockets of crooked generals and officials. American-supplied weapons were often sold on the black market, or simply abandoned on the battlefield for Mao's disciplined and highly motivated peasant armies to pick up. Mao's forces, for all their ideological rigidity and future brutality, offered a compelling alternative: an end to corruption, stability, and land for the tillers. They won the Civil War not because of some grand conspiracy hatched in Moscow, but because they had won the support, or at least the acquiescence, of the Chinese people. The experts knew this. The State Department's China hands, men like John Peyton Davies, John S. Service, and O. Edmund Clubb, were brilliant, experienced diplomats who spoke the language and understood the complex currents of Chinese society. For years, they had sent cables back to Washington warning that Chiang's regime was a hollow shell and that Mao's victory was inevitable. They argued that the U.S. should prepare for this reality, perhaps even attempt to drive a wedge between Mao and Stalin, recognizing that Chinese communism had its own deep nationalist roots. They told the truth. And for this, they would be crucified. Their reports were buried, their advice ignored. It was politically impossible for the Truman administration to admit that billions of dollars had been wasted on a lost cause. It was far easier, and far more politically expedient, to invent a story of betrayal. Classified memo, paraphrased from a back-channel communication between a Republican senator's aide and a sympathetic journalist late 1949. Subject, the China narrative. Publicly, we hammered the betrayal angle. We don't need to prove it. We just need to ask the question. Who lost China? Forces the administration onto the defensive. It implies treason in the State Department. This isn't about Chiang anymore, he's finished. This is about us. The fall of China is the greatest gift we could have asked for. It validates everything we've been saying about the global communist menace. It's no longer a European problem. It's in our backyard, it's everywhere. This failure gives us the mandate to do what should have been done years ago. Conduct a root and branch purge of the sympathizers in our own government and justify a global military-first containment policy. We didn't lose China. We gained a reason to fight the war everywhere forever. The long-term consequences of this deliberate misreading of history were devastating, both at home and abroad. Domestically, the "Who lost China" narrative became the foundational lie of the McCarthy era. It fueled a vicious witch hunt that destroyed the careers of the very diplomats who understood Asia best. The State Department was purged of its top experts, creating a vacuum of knowledge that would have catastrophic consequences for decades. A generation of policymakers was taught that telling uncomfortable truths about Asia was career suicide. Abroad, the loss of China gave birth to the domino theory, the simplistic, paranoid belief that if one nation fell to communism, its neighbors would inevitably follow. This theory locked the United States into a rigid ideological posture that saw every nationalist movement in the developing world through the prism of the East-West conflict. It prevented any recognition of the People's Republic of China for more than 2 decades, treating the exiled regime on Taiwan as the legitimate government of all of China, a dangerous fiction that brought the world to the brink of war on several occasions. More than anything, it created the political climate that made the next war not only possible, but necessary. Having lost China, no American president would dare be accused of losing Korea. The political firestorm ignited by the loss of China created a new, non-negotiable imperative in Washington. There would be no more losses. The political cost was simply too high. No president, no party, could survive the accusation of being soft on communism in the wake of Mao's victory. This new, rigid paranoia didn't have to wait long for a test. It came on a rainy Sunday morning, June 25, 1950, at a place most Americans had never heard of, the 38th parallel, the arbitrary line of latitude that divided the Korean peninsula. 100,000 North Korean soldiers, backed by Soviet-made T-34 tanks, poured south, shattering the defenses of the Republic of Korea Army. The invasion was swift, brutal, and seemingly unstoppable. The official story, televised and broadcast to a horrified Western world, was one of unprovoked, naked aggression, a clear case of a communist puppet state doing the bidding of its masters in Moscow. It was portrayed as the Asian equivalent of Hitler marching into Poland. The United States, acting under the fig leaf of a United Nations resolution, passed only because the Soviet delegate was boycotting the Security Council in a dispute over China's seat, rushed to the defense of the South. It was a noble police action, a righteous crusade to halt the spread of totalitarianism. General Douglas MacArthur, the theatrical proconsul of occupied Japan, was placed in command, and American GIS were once again sent to fight and die on foreign soil for the cause of freedom. This narrative, while emotionally compelling, conveniently omits the deeply cynical context. The Korean War was not an isolated crisis. It was the violent, inevitable culmination of the new Cold War architecture. More than that, it was an opportunity. For the American military and political establishment, the invasion of South Korea was the crisis they had been waiting for. Before June 1950, President Truman was fighting a desperate battle with Congress to rein in military spending. The post-war demobilization was still a popular impulse. The Pentagon's budget was a relatively modest $13 billion. A top-secret, deeply influential policy paper, National Security Council Report 68, NSC 68, had been sitting on Truman's desk since April. It was a terrifying document. It painted the Cold War in apocalyptic terms, a zero-sum conflict between the slave society of the Soviet Union and the free world. Its recommendation was radical: a massive, permanent, and immediate buildup of American military power, a tripling of the defense budget to confront communism on a global scale. In the political climate of early 1950, NSC 68 was seen as too alarmist, too expensive, politically unfeasible. The North Korean invasion changed that overnight. It was the real-world event that turned NSC 68's paranoid prophecies into official U.S. policy. The war itself became a ghastly laboratory. It was the first limited war of the nuclear age, a brutal experiment in how to fight a superpower proxy conflict without triggering global annihilation. This was the place where Cold War theories were tested on human subjects. It was the site of the first large-scale jet fighter combat, as American F-86 Sabres dueled with Soviet-piloted MiG-15s in the skies over the Yalu River in a secret air war Moscow and Washington both publicly denied. It saw the systematic use of napalm, which incinerated entire North Korean cities, burning them to the ground with a ferocity that shocked even seasoned World War II commanders. It was the birthplace of the MASH unit, the Mobile Army Surgical Hospital, and the widespread use of helicopters for medical evacuation, a development that revolutionized trauma care but also normalized the expectation of industrial-scale casualties. Korea was a rehearsal, a bloody, full-dress rehearsal for a generation of warfare to come. Uncomfortable quote from a conversation overheard between a senior Pentagon official and a defense contractor lobbyist at a Washington club, circa 1951. Of course, the whole thing is a tragedy. Awful business. But if you're asking me if the timing was fortuitous, well, Truman was about to gut us. We were planning for a peacetime army. NSC 68 was gathering dust. Now, the budget is a fire hose. We're building the carriers, the bombers, the bases in Europe and Asia. Everything the paper asked for. Every GI who dies in that godforsaken country is a justification for a line item in the new budget. We're not just fighting the North Koreans, we're fighting against the possibility of peace breaking out. This war, in the long run, is the best thing that could have happened to American national security. It made us serious. The long-term consequences of this forgotten war were profound and enduring. After 3 years of savage fighting, which saw Chinese intervention, the near use of atomic weapons, and the deaths of nearly 5 million people, mostly Korean civilians, the war ended in a bitter stalemate. The armistice line was drawn almost exactly where the war had begun, at the 38th parallel. Nothing had been gained, but everything had changed. The U.S. defense budget had quadrupled, and it would never return to pre-war levels. The military-industrial complex that President Eisenhower would later warn against was now a permanent, powerful fixture of the American economy. The presidency had accrued vast new powers to wage undeclared wars. The United States had now committed itself to maintaining a global network of military bases and alliances, becoming the permanent policeman of the non-communist world. The template for Vietnam was set: a limited undeclared war in a divided Asian country, justified by the domino theory, fought at immense human cost for abstract geopolitical goals. The Korean War wasn't forgotten. It was absorbed into the DNA of the national security state, the brutal rehearsal that made the next 40 years of Cold War confrontation possible. The brutal stalemate in Korea taught the new architects of the Cold War a valuable, if bloody, lesson. Direct military confrontation was a meat grinder. It was expensive, unpopular, and carried the ever-present risk of escalating into a nuclear exchange. A new, more subtle doctrine was required for a world where the dominoes weren't always nation-states with standing armies, but fragile democracies sitting on top of resources the West considered its own. The laboratory for this new form of warfare would be a place of ancient civilization and modern grievance: Iran. The prize wasn't ideology, it was oil. In 1951, Iran was not a communist state. It was a messy, vibrant, and functioning constitutional monarchy. Its parliament, the Majlis, was a forum of raucous debate, and its prime minister, elected by that parliament, was a man named Mohammad Mossadegh. Mossadegh was an eccentric, emotional, 70-year-old aristocrat who often received foreign dignitaries from his bed, clad in pajamas. He was also a fiercely principled nationalist. His singular obsession was a British corporation called the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, or AIOC, the forerunner of modern-day BP. For decades, the AIOC had operated the vast Iranian oil fields under a concession that was, to put it mildly, exploitative. It was colonial plunder disguised as a business contract. Britain received immense wealth that fueled its post-war recovery, while Iran received a fraction of the profits, less even than the company paid in British taxes. The company operated as a state within a state, with its own security, its own towns, and a profound contempt for the Iranian people. Mossadegh's platform was simple and wildly popular. Iran's oil belonged to the Iranians. He would nationalize the AIOC. For London, this was an existential threat. It wasn't just about the money, it was about the precedent. If Iran got away with it, Egypt might nationalize the Suez Canal, and other colonies and protectorates across their crumbling empire might get similar ideas. The British government, led by Clement Attlee's Labour Party, and then Winston Churchill's returning Conservatives, responded with fury. They imposed a crippling naval blockade on Iran, preventing it from selling its own oil on the international market. They took Iran to the International Court of Justice and lost. When all else failed, they turned to their special relationship partner, the United States, for help. The Truman administration had been wary, viewing the dispute as a nasty remnant of British colonialism and fearing that pushing Mossadegh too hard would drive him into the arms of the Soviets. But in 1953, there was a new administration in Washington. President Eisenhower and his Secretary of State John Foster Dulles and CIA Director Allen Dulles, the Dulles brothers, were zealous, ideological Cold Warriors. For them, the world was a simple black and white photograph. This is where the lie was constructed. The British, with the eager participation of the CIA, began a masterful campaign of psychological warfare. Mossadegh, the nationalist, was rebranded. He was painted as a weak, hysterical old man who, in his chaotic pursuit of nationalization, was creating a power vacuum. Into this vacuum, they argued, would step Iran's small but well-organized communist party, the Tudeh Party. The domino of Iran was about to fall, not because Mossadegh was a communist, but because his stubborn nationalism was inadvertently paving the way for a Soviet takeover. It was a phantom threat, manufactured for a specific purpose. Mossadegh had actively suppressed the Tudeh Party, and his government had no intention of aligning with Moscow. But the narrative was too convenient to be ignored. The potential loss of Iran, with its vast oil reserves and strategic border with the Soviet Union, was presented in Washington as a threat on par with the loss of China. Uncomfortable quote from a cable sent by the CIA's Tehran station chief Kermit Roosevelt Jr. to CIA headquarters in Langley, August 1953. The communist threat is the necessary public justification, the hook on which we hang the entire operation. It is what has persuaded State and the White House, but on the ground, we are not fighting communists. We are fighting a popular, legally elected government. Our assets are not pro-democracy forces. They are a collection of disgruntled officers, bribed journalists, and hired street thugs. We have successfully painted the Prime Minister as a madman and the Shah as the symbol of stability. This is not a counterinsurgency. This is a corporate seizure executed by an intelligence agency. We are not protecting Iran. We are returning it to its rightful owners. The operation, codenamed TPA-JAX, was the CIA's coming-of-age party. It cost barely $1 million. Kermit Roosevelt Jr., the grandson of President Teddy Roosevelt, arrived in Tehran with a suitcase full of cash and a license to overthrow a government. The agency paid newspapers to print slanderous articles and forged photographs depicting Mossadegh as a communist stooge and a Jewish agent. They bribed mullahs to preach against him in the mosques. They hired circus performers, wrestlers, and street gangs to pose as popular uprisings. staging violent pro-Shah demonstrations that created an atmosphere of chaos. And crucially, they bought the loyalty of key Iranian military commanders. On August 19, 1953, the manufactured chaos reached its peak. The military on cue moved in. Mossadegh was arrested, his house shelled. The Shah, who had timidly fled to Rome, was flown back and installed on the peacock throne. No longer a constitutional monarch, but an absolute dictator. The long-term consequence of this cheap, ruthlessly efficient coup was a geopolitical catastrophe that continues to unfold to this day. In the short term, it was a wild success. The AIOC was replaced by a consortium of Western oil companies, with U.S. firms now getting a 40% cut. The oil flowed west, but the CIA had destroyed Iranian democracy, replacing it with 26 years of the Shah's repressive rule, enforced by his notoriously brutal secret police, the Savak, which the CIA helped to train. This tyranny bred a deep, simmering, and entirely justified hatred of the United States, the nation that had stolen their democracy. This popular rage finally exploded in 1979, with the Iranian Revolution, which swept away the Shah and brought to power the Ayatollah Khomeini, a fiercely anti-American cleric. In deposing a secular nationalist they couldn't control, the CIA had inadvertently planted the seeds of the Islamic Republic, creating a far more radical, determined, and enduring adversary. Operation Ajax wasn't just a coup. It was the creation of a ghost that would haunt American foreign policy for the rest of the century and beyond. If Operation Ajax in Iran was the CIA's successful field test, a bespoke handcrafted coup for a major strategic prize, then Guatemala, less than a year later, was the moment the blueprint was put into mass production. The template was proven: identify a popular, nationalist leader, redefine their economic policies as a communist threat, use propaganda to create an atmosphere of crisis, and then use a small amount of cash and a handful of operatives to tip the country into chaos. The lesson learned in Tehran was that a sovereign nation's government was just another variable to be managed. In the summer of 1954, the agency would apply this lesson to America's own backyard, and the stated motive would once again be the Cold War. But the real motive had nothing to do with Karl Marx and everything to do with the price of bananas. To understand the 1954 Guatemalan coup, you don't need a map of the world. You need a corporate flowchart. The nation of Guatemala in the early 1950s was less a country and more a wholly owned subsidiary of a single American corporation, the United Fruit Company. Known as El Pulpo, the octopus, its tentacles reached into every aspect of Guatemalan life. It owned nearly half of the country's arable land, its only major port, its entire railway system, and its telephone and telegraph network. It was the largest employer, the largest landowner, and it paid virtually no taxes. For decades, it had propped up a series of brutal, compliant dictators who ensured that the profits from Guatemala's soil flowed north, not to its people, the vast majority of whom were landless, impoverished indigenous peasants. But in 1944, a popular uprising ushered in a decade of unprecedented democracy. And in 1951, Guatemalans elected a man named Jacobo Arbenz Guzman as their president. Arbenz was a former army officer, a moderate capitalist reformer, not a revolutionary communist. His goal was to turn Guatemala from a feudal, colonial-style economy into a modern, self-sufficient nation. His signature policy was an ambitious land reform program known as Decree 900. The law was elegant in its design and its target. It called for the expropriation of large, uncultivated estates for redistribution to landless peasants. The primary target, of course, was the United Fruit Company, which held hundreds of thousands of acres of prime land fallow as a way to stifle competition and keep prices high. But here was the brilliant legalistic trap. The government offered to compensate United Fruit for the land at the value the company itself had declared on its tax rolls. For decades, United Fruit had systematically and fraudulently undervalued its land to evade taxes. Now Arbenz was simply taking them at their word. He was offering to pay them exactly what they had claimed the land was worth. For El Pulpo, This was an intolerable act of aggression. This is where the story pivots from a national dispute over land to a Cold War crisis. The United Fruit Company launched one of the most sophisticated and successful public relations campaigns in history. They hired Edward Bernays, the so-called father of public relations and a nephew of Sigmund Freud, a man who understood how to manipulate the subconscious fears of the American public. Bernays' mission was to sell a war. He orchestrated a phantom Red Scare, framing Arbenz' legitimate capitalist land reform as the first step toward a Soviet takeover of Central America. He created fake news, planting stories in the New York Times and other major publications about Soviet influence in Guatemala. He flew influential congressmen and journalists on carefully curated trips to the country, where they were shown evidence of the creeping communist menace. The narrative took hold. Guatemala was a Soviet beachhead in the Western Hemisphere. The truth was irrelevant. The perception was everything. Making the sale inside the Eisenhower administration was shockingly easy, because the boardroom and the cabinet room were essentially the same place. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles and his brother, CIA Director Allen Dulles, were not impartial arbiters of foreign policy. Their former law firm Sullivan and Cromwell had represented United Fruit for years. The Dulles brothers had personally drafted some of the contracts that gave the company its stranglehold over Guatemala. This wasn't a policy decision. It was a conflict of interest on a global scale. When United Fruit called for help, the Dulles brothers answered. Uncomfortable, quote, attributed to a United Fruit Company executive during a planning meeting with Edward Bernays. Look, Ed, don't talk to me about hearts and minds or isms. We are not in the business of ideology. We are in the business of bananas. Arbenz' little law changed the value of our assets. So we, in turn, must change his government. It's just a more aggressive form of corporate negotiation. Your job is to make it sound like we're saving the world from the Red Menace. Our friends at Langley will handle the operational details. But let's be clear, this isn't about the Kremlin. This is about our shareholders. We need him gone. The resulting CIA plot, Operation PB Success, was Ajax on a tropical shoestring. The agency armed, trained, and funded a tiny rebel force of a few hundred men, led by an exiled Guatemalan officer named Carlos Castillo Armas. But the real weapon was psychological. The CIA set up a clandestine radio station, the Voice of Liberation, which broadcast fabricated news reports of a massive popular uprising and a huge invading army. CIA pilots flew a few aging unmarked bombers over Guatemala City, dropping a handful of bombs and leaflets to create panic and the illusion of an overwhelming force. Arbenz's own army, thoroughly infiltrated by CIA assets and terrified of a direct confrontation with the United States, refused to fight. The government collapsed. Arbenz fled into exile, and Castillo Armas was installed as the new dictator. He immediately returned the expropriated land to United Fruit, disenfranchised the majority of the population by barring illiterates from voting, and began hunting down and executing his political opponents. The long-term consequence was a bloodbath. The 1954 coup didn't save Guatemala from communism. It plunged the nation into nearly 4 decades of civil war and brutal military rule. It led to the deaths of some 200,000 people, the vast majority of them indigenous Mayans slaughtered by a succession of US-backed military regimes. It was a state-sponsored genocide, a Holocaust born from a corporate lobbyist's strategy memo. The United States had not defended democracy. It had murdered it to keep bananas cheap. While the Central Intelligence Agency was busy murdering democracies for fruit companies, playing a brutish and obvious game in the world's so-called backwaters, a far more elegant and devastating form of rot was eating away at the very heart of the vaunted special relationship. The American national security state, obsessed with phantom communists in the jungles of Guatemala and the rice paddies of Asia, was blissfully unaware that its most sensitive secrets were being systematically siphoned off, not by shadowy figures in trench coats, but by the impeccably tailored Cambridge-educated gentlemen they called their closest allies. The enemy wasn't at the gate. The enemy was already in the drawing room swirling a brandy and laughing at their jokes. This was the age of the Cambridge Five: Kim Philby, Donald McLean, Guy Burgess, Anthony Blunt, and a likely fifth, John Cairncross. Their story is not one of grubby espionage for money or blackmail. It is a story of ideological treason at the highest possible level, a betrayal so profound it called into question the very foundations of the Western establishment. Recruited in the fevered anti-fascist atmosphere of Cambridge University in the 1930s, they saw Soviet communism not as a tyranny, but as the only pure muscular force capable of defeating Hitler. They made their choice then, a pact with history, and for the next 2 decades they kept their promise with a chilling discipline that outmatched anything the West could produce. They were not merely spies, they were apostles of a rival faith who had successfully infiltrated the Vatican. And what a magnificent infiltration it was. They didn't have to break down doors. Their class, their accent, and their effortless charm opened them all. Donald McLean, the diplomat, was sent to the British Embassy in Washington in the mid-1940s, where he served on the committee that shared atomic energy secrets between the US and the UK. He had access to the most terrifying knowledge on Earth, and he passed it all to his handler in Moscow. Guy Burgess, a brilliant, debauched, and wildly indiscreet alcoholic, used his positions at the BBC and the Foreign Office to gather intelligence, his chaotic personal life providing the perfect cover for his clandestine activities. Anthony Blunt, the refined art historian, worked for MI5, the UK's domestic security service during the war, hunting communists by day while serving their cause by night. He would later become surveyor of the Queen's pictures, a spy hiding in plain sight at the very heart of the British monarchy. But the master, the crown jewel of Soviet intelligence, was Harold Kim Philby. His career was a work of diabolical genius. He rose through the ranks of MI6, Britain's Foreign Intelligence Service, to become the head of its anti-Soviet section. His job was to dismantle the very networks he was secretly serving. In 1949, he was posted to Washington as the chief British intelligence liaison to the newly formed CIA and the FBI. He was the central hub, the trusted partner through whom all the most sensitive Anglo-American intelligence flowed. He would have long, boozy lunches with James Jesus Angleton, the CIA's legendary and future chief of counterintelligence, the two men bonding over their shared mission to defeat the global communist conspiracy. Philby advised Angleton on how to catch Soviet moles, all while being the greatest Soviet mole in history. He sent hundreds of anti-communist agents in Albania to their deaths. He compromised nearly every major MI6 and CIA operation against the Soviets for a decade. Classified memo, eyes-only assessment from the CIA Director's Office to the National Security Advisor, circulated after the 1951 defection of McLean and Burgess. Subject: Preliminary Damage Assessment and Counterintelligence Implications, UK Liaison. The full scope of the hemorrhage is not yet known, but we must now operate under the assumption that it has been catastrophic. For years, we have treated MI6 as a trusted partner. We have shared raw signals intelligence, nuclear targeting data, and the identities of our most sensitive human assets. McLean's access alone means the Soviets likely have a complete blueprint of our atomic energy program. This is not the work of a low-level clerk. This is a systemic penetration at the highest echelon of the British establishment. Their old boy network and pathological obsession with class have proven to be a greater threat to our security than the entire Red Army. They protected these men, vouched for them, promoted them. We can no longer trust their vetting, their methods, or their personnel. Every joint operation is compromised. Every piece of intelligence they provide must be considered potential disinformation. We are not dealing with an ally who has a security problem. We are dealing with an ally whose very power structure is a security problem. The rot is in the bones. The house of cards began to tremble in 1951. American intelligence had broken Soviet codes and realized there was a high-level mole in the British embassy who had been leaking atomic secrets. The evidence pointed directly to Donald McLean. Philby, a friend of McLean's and part of the investigative team, learned that his colleague was about to be unmasked. He orchestrated the escape, dispatching the unstable Guy Burgess, who was also under suspicion, to warn McLean. The two diplomats vanished, resurfacing years later in Moscow. The defection was a global scandal, a humiliating blow to British prestige. Suspicion immediately fell on Philby as the third man who must have tipped them off. Yet incredibly, he brazened it out. He was interrogated, forced to resign from MI6, but never charged. His establishment friends closed ranks, defending him as a gentleman who had simply been duped by his treacherous friends. He was cleared by the Foreign Secretary in Parliament, a shocking act of institutional self-preservation. It took another 12 years before the net finally closed, and Philby himself defected to Moscow in 1963. The long-term consequence was the poisoning of trust at the core of the Western Alliance. The Cambridge Five didn't just steal secrets, they planted a virus of paranoia that would cripple Western intelligence for a generation. The Americans, feeling profoundly betrayed, would turn inward, launching devastating internal mole hunts that tore their own agencies apart, forever searching for their own Kim Philby. The spies had taught them the ultimate Cold War lesson. The most dangerous enemy is the one who looks and sounds just like you. While the British establishment was busy performing emergency surgery to save its own reputation from the cancer of the Cambridge Five, a far more audacious act of political surgery was being prepared in Moscow. On March 5, 1953, the monster at the heart of the Soviet system, Joseph Stalin, finally died. He suffered a cerebral hemorrhage, left to lie in a puddle of his own urine for hours by his terrified inner circle, who were too scared to summon a doctor without his permission. His death created a power vacuum of terrifying proportions. For 25 years, he had been the sun around which the entire communist world orbited, a source of both light and lethal radiation. Now the sun had gone out. In the ensuing darkness, his heirs, the ruthless secret police chief Lavrenti Beria, the stolid Georgy Malenkov, the veteran diplomat Vyacheslav Molotov, and a seemingly crude, backslapping Ukrainian named Nikita Khrushchev, began to circle one another, knives hidden behind their backs. For 3 years, a tense collective leadership ruled the Kremlin. Beria was the first to go, arrested at a Politburo meeting and executed before he could use the security apparatus to seize power. But the ghost of Stalin still haunted every decision, every policy. The system he built, a vast architecture of terror, purges, and paranoia, was still in place. The country was exhausted. The prison camps of the Gulag were still full, and the party itself was paralyzed by fear. Someone had to break the spell. That someone would be Khrushchev, the man his rivals most underestimated. He was the folksy peasant, the corn enthusiast, the shoebanger. He was also a master of political infighting, a survivor of Stalin's deadliest purges who had climbed the bloody ladder of power by demonstrating an unwavering loyalty and a ruthless efficiency in carrying out the dictator's orders, especially in his old fiefdom of Ukraine. The moment came on the final night of the 20th Party Congress in the early hours of February 25, 1956. After the official proceedings had concluded, the delegates were ordered back into the Great Hall. The doors were locked. Foreign observers were expelled. Khrushchev mounted the rostrum to deliver a speech that was not on any official agenda. For 4 straight hours, in a torrent of righteous, thunderous rhetoric, he proceeded to systematically dismantle the myth of Joseph Stalin. It was an act of political exorcism. He called it On the Cult of Personality and Its Consequences. We call it the secret speech. He detailed Stalin's megalomania, his sickly suspiciousness, his utter incompetence in the lead-up to the Nazi invasion. He read from the last letters of condemned old Bolsheviks, men who went to their deaths proclaiming their love for the very party that was murdering them. He detailed the use of torture, the false confessions, the execution of thousands of loyal party members. The delegates in the hall sat in stunned, terrified silence. Some fainted. Others reportedly had heart attacks. These were men who had built their entire world on the bedrock of Stalin's infallibility. And now, the General Secretary of the Communist Party was telling them it was all a lie, all a crime. It was presented as a great moral reckoning, a courageous return to the pure, uncorrupted principles of Leninism. It was the moment the party, it seemed, was finally telling the truth about itself. This, like so many other official stories of the Cold War, was a profound deception. The secret speech was not an act of conscience. It was a calculated, brutal, and brilliantly effective power play. It was Khrushchev's weapon to secure his own absolute control. First, by denouncing Stalin, he was implicitly denouncing his rivals in the collective leadership. Men like Molotov and Malenkov were far more intimately associated with Stalin's inner circle and the high terror of the 1930s. Khrushchev, while deeply complicit himself, had managed to maintain the image of an outsider. He was positioning himself as the reformer, the man of the people, the one brave enough to break with the dark past. Second, and most critically, his critique was surgically precise. He condemned Stalin the man, the personality, but he never once condemned the Communist Party or the Soviet system itself. The purges were a violation of Leninist norms, not a natural outcome of a one-party totalitarian state. The terror was an aberration, not the system's logical conclusion. This was the masterstroke. He was allowing the party to absolve itself. The message was, the faith is true, we just followed a false prophet. We can now return to the correct path, and I am the one to lead you there. He was lancing the boil of Stalin to save the patient of the party. Classified memo. A fictionalized reconstruction of Khrushchev's private thoughts, dictated to a trusted aide. They sat there, white as sheets. The fools. They think this is about history. It is about the future. My future. For years we lived in his shadow, terrified that our own name would be next on the list. Now I will use his shadow to terrify them. I will become the anti-Stalin. I will tie Molotov and the others to the corpse and sink them with it. They cannot defend him without condemning themselves. They cannot attack him without agreeing with me. By demolishing the icon, I inherit the altar. The party needs a new father, a kinder one perhaps, but a father nonetheless. They will cheer me for my bravery, and in doing so they will hand me the crown. The speech was secret, but a secret of this magnitude could never be contained. It spread through the party like a shockwave. Copies were leaked. The Israeli intelligence service, Shin Bet, obtained a version from a Polish journalist whose communist girlfriend had access to it. It was promptly handed over to the CIA, which, recognizing its explosive potential, broadcast the entire text into Eastern Europe via Radio Free Europe. The consequences were catastrophic and entirely unintended. Khrushchev thought he was performing a controlled demolition. Instead, he lit the fuse on a powder keg. In Poland, it fueled riots and a political crisis that nearly led to a Soviet invasion. In Hungary, it inspired a full-blown revolution. If the great Stalin was a fraud and a monster, the people reasoned, then the little Stalins ruling them in Budapest must be as well. The very speech designed to consolidate the communist bloc's power ended up triggering the most violent challenge to it yet. Furthermore, it shattered the unity of the communist world. In Beijing, Mao Zedong was appalled. He saw the attack on a cult of personality as a direct personal assault on his own authority. This was the moment the Sino-Soviet split began in earnest, a schism that would fracture the monolithic communist threat and create a new, far more complex and dangerous geopolitical game. Khrushchev's grab for power had worked, but the truth, once released, had a life of its own. Khrushchev's secret speech had sent a seismic tremor through the foundations of the communist world, cracking the monolithic facade and exposing the rotten truth at its core. But the West, watching with a sense of smug satisfaction, was about to experience its own tectonic shift, its own moment of humiliating self-revelation. The illusion that was about to be shattered was not ideological, but imperial. It was the deeply cherished myth that Great Britain and France were still global powers, capable of imposing their will upon the world, as they had for centuries. The stage for this final tragic act of imperial theater was a 120-mile-long ditch dug through the Egyptian desert, the Suez Canal. Since its completion in 1869, the Suez Canal had been more than a waterway. It was the jugular vein of the British Empire, the vital artery connecting Britain to India, to its oil supplies in the Persian Gulf, and to its prestige as a world power. It was controlled by the Suez Canal Company, a corporation that was technically private, but was a transparent instrument of British and French foreign policy. And in 1956, Egypt, the country through which the canal flowed, was led by a new kind of Arab leader, Gamal Abdel Nasser. He was a charismatic, defiant nationalist, a symbol of a post-colonial world that was no longer content to take orders from London or Paris. Nasser's dream was to build the Aswan High Dam, a project that would modernize Egypt overnight. When the United States and Britain, wary of his non-aligned stance and his arms deals with the Eastern Bloc, abruptly withdrew their funding for the dam, Nasser responded with a move of audacious simplicity. On July 26, 1956, he nationalized the Suez Canal Company, declaring that its revenues would pay for the dam. He was, in effect, seizing the empire's jugular vein. For British Prime Minister Anthony Eden, this was an intolerable act, a personal and national humiliation. Eden was a man haunted by the ghosts of the 1930s, the great failure of his generation, the appeasement of Hitler. In Nasser, he saw not a nationalist leader, but another Mussolini, a tin-pot dictator who had to be crushed before he became a greater threat. For the French, led by Prime Minister Guy Mollet, the motive was even more visceral. They were bogged down in a brutal colonial war in Algeria, and they correctly saw Nasser as the chief supplier of arms and inspiration to the Algerian rebels. For both nations, this was not about international law or shipping rights. It was a last, desperate attempt to turn back the clock, to prove that the old rules still applied, and that men like Nasser could be disciplined. What followed was a conspiracy of breathtaking cynicism, a plot hatched in secret that reeked of 19th-century gunboat diplomacy. Knowing that a direct, unprovoked colonial-style invasion would be a public relations disaster, Britain and France needed a pretext. They found a willing partner in Israel, a nation with its own list of grievances against Nasser's Egypt. At a secret meeting in Sèvres, outside Paris, the three countries signed a clandestine agreement, the Protocol of Sèvres. The plan was a three-act play of deception. Act 1. Israel would invade Egypt's Sinai Peninsula, driving toward the canal. Act 2. Britain and France would issue an ultimatum to both sides demanding they withdraw from the canal zone to protect international shipping. Act 3. When Nasser, the victim of the invasion, inevitably refused, the Anglo-French forces would intervene as neutral peacekeepers, seizing the canal zone by force. It was a choreographed lie from start to finish. Uncomfortable. Quote, from the private diaries of British Prime Minister Anthony Eden, October 1956. The cabinet is nervous. They speak of the Americans, of the United Nations, of world opinion. They do not understand. This is not about opinion polls, it is about will. I saw this disease in 1938. It starts with a small man with a large mustache who tests our resolve. He seizes a Rhineland, an Abyssinia, a Suez Canal. We are told to be patient, to negotiate, and in our patience we breed a monster. Nasser is not a statesman, he is a gangster, and you do not negotiate with gangsters, you remove them. The Americans are naive. They sit across their ocean and preach morality, forgetting that it was our power, our empire, that built the world they now so comfortably inhabit. We will act, with or without them. We will cut out this cancer. History will thank us for it. On October 29th, the play began. Israeli forces stormed the Sinai. The ultimatum was issued. Nasser refused. On November 5th, British and French paratroopers landed. The invasion was a military success. Port Said was seized, but it was a geopolitical catastrophe of the first order. They had made one fatal miscalculation. They believed the world was still theirs to command. It was not. The New World had two masters, and they had failed to ask permission from either. The Soviet Union, in the midst of brutally crushing the Hungarian Revolution, seized the propaganda gift, threatening to rain nuclear missiles down on London and Paris. But the truly decisive blow came not from Moscow, but from Washington. President Dwight D. Eisenhower was incandescent with rage. The invasion had made a mockery of the West's moral outrage over Hungary. It threatened to push the entire Arab world into the Soviet camp, and most unforgivably, his allies had lied to him and acted behind his back. Eisenhower did not deploy the Sixth Fleet. He deployed the U.S. Treasury. He gave a simple order: begin selling off the U.S. government's sterling bond reserves. It was a financial nuclear option. The threat of a run on the pound and a full-scale collapse of the British economy was immediate. Eden's government buckled in a matter of hours. A humiliating ceasefire was declared. The troops were withdrawn. The long-term consequence was the public, undeniable, and brutal end of an era. Britain and France were exposed as paper tigers, nations that could no longer conduct a major foreign policy operation without an American green light. The special relationship was reforged into one of master and subordinate. The power vacuum in the Middle East was now filled not by the old empires, but by the two new superpowers, the US and the USSR, who would play out their deadly game there for the next 30 years. Suez was the precise moment the British Empire died, not with a bang, but with a panicked phone call from the Chancellor of the Exchequer, as the old empires of Britain and France were committing a slow public suicide in the sands of the Sinai. Another, far more profound drama was unfolding in the heart of Europe. The two events, Suez and Hungary, occurred in the exact same week of 1956. They are inextricably linked not by strategy but by a shared, searing hypocrisy. While the West was tearing itself apart over a canal, a people who had taken its promises of freedom seriously were being led to the slaughter, their desperate pleas for help deliberately amplified, and then just as deliberately ignored. The story of the Hungarian Revolution is not just a tragedy of Soviet brutality. It is one of the most cynical betrayals of the Cold War, a sacrifice made on the altar of propaganda. The seeds of the uprising, as we've seen, were sown by Khrushchev's secret speech. If Stalin was a criminal, then the communist regime in Hungary, led by the little Stalin, Matyas Rákosi, was a criminal enterprise. On October 23, 1956, what began as a student demonstration in Budapest swelled into a nationwide revolt. The symbols of Soviet domination were torn down. The giant bronze statue of Stalin was toppled, its severed head dragged through the streets. The hated secret police, the AVH, were hunted down. It was a moment of pure, ecstatic, and violent liberation. The Kremlin, caught off guard, initially wavered. A reformist communist, Imre Nagy, was swept to power. Soviet tanks, after some initial bloody clashes, withdrew from the capital. For 10 brief days, Hungary was free. Nagy's government moved with breathtaking speed, establishing a multi-party system, releasing political prisoners, and, in a fatal move, declaring Hungary's withdrawal from the Warsaw Pact and its neutrality in the Cold War. Throughout these heady days, the Hungarian people were not alone. They had a voice coming to them from across the Iron Curtain, a voice that seemed to promise them the full backing of the free world. It came from the radio. Specifically, Radio Free Europe, a CIA-funded station based in Munich, which had for years been beaming a steady stream of anti-communist news and commentary into the Eastern Bloc. During the revolution, RFE's broadcasts shifted from commentary to what sounded like active encouragement. They didn't just report on the uprising, they celebrated it, magnified it, and framed it as the first great victory in the liberation of Eastern Europe. They offered tactical advice to the freedom fighters, quoting from Western military manuals on how to destroy tanks. They selectively edited and amplified statements from Western leaders, like Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, making vague expressions of sympathy sound like concrete promises of aid. The clear, unmistakable implication, broadcast day and night, was this: hold on, keep fighting. The West is coming. The cavalry is on its way. It was a lie. A murderous, calculated lie. In Washington, the Eisenhower administration had absolutely no intention of intervening in Hungary. The policy was clear, if unspoken. Any country already under Soviet military occupation was part of their sphere. To intervene would be to risk World War III, a nuclear exchange over Budapest. Eisenhower's entire rollback and liberation rhetoric had been just that. Rhetoric, designed for domestic political consumption, a way to sound tougher than Truman's containment. When faced with a real-world test, the policy was revealed to be a complete bluff. The Suez Crisis erupting at the exact same moment was the perfect excuse. The White House could claim, with some justification, that it was distracted by the treachery of its own allies. It was a convenient alibi for an inaction that had already been decided upon. Classified memo. Internal directive from a senior CIA official in the Psychological Strategy Division. To the head of Radio Free Europe is Hungarian desk, October 1956. Subject: Narrative guidance for the Hungarian situation. The primary objective is to maximize the psychological and propaganda impact of the events in Budapest. We must underscore the contrast between the people's authentic desire for freedom and the brutal nature of Soviet imperialism. Emphasize heroic resistance. Use active, encouraging language. The narrative is David versus Goliath. While we must avoid making explicit, attributable promises of military aid, the tone should convey that their struggle is not in vain and is fully supported by the West. Every day they hold out is another day we can broadcast the images of Soviet tanks burning in a European capital. This is a priceless opportunity to expose the true face of communism to the world. Their sacrifice, should it come to that, must serve the greater strategic purpose of delegitimizing the entire Soviet project. We are not managing an operation, we are shaping a legacy. The legacy was shaped in blood. Convinced by Nagy's declaration of neutrality that he had lost control, Khrushchev gave the order. In the pre-dawn hours of November 4, 1956, a second, far larger Soviet invasion force with 1,000 tanks stormed into Budapest. The freedom fighters, armed with little more than rifles and Molotov cocktails, fought back with incredible bravery. Their last desperate radio broadcast pleaded with the world for the help they had been led to believe was coming. "Help us! Help us! Help us!" One transmission cried out before being replaced by the sound of the Soviet national anthem. The West was silent. The revolution was crushed. Some 2,500 Hungarians were killed in the fighting. Imre Nagy was arrested and later executed. 200,000 refugees fled to the West. The long-term consequence was a lesson written in steel. It proved that the spheres of influence agreed upon at Yalta were absolute. The West would make speeches, pass resolutions, and broadcast encouragement, but it would not lift a finger to help anyone inside the Soviet cage. For a generation of Eastern Europeans, the word liberation became a sick joke. It was something Americans talked about, but something Hungarians died for. The West got its propaganda victory, a clear and enduring image of Soviet tyranny. The price was paid in full by the people of Hungary. The brutal suppression of the Hungarian Revolution had reset the chessboard in Europe, reinforcing the cruel permanence of the Iron Curtain. The West had won a moral argument while losing any claim to moral courage. But the Cold War was about to pivot from a terrestrial struggle of tanks and ideology to a celestial one of orbits and trajectories. The new battlefield would be the cold, silent vacuum of space. And the first shot was not a missile, but a sound, a simple, hypnotic, and utterly terrifying beep. On October 4, 1957, a Soviet R-7 Semyorka rocket, a modified intercontinental ballistic missile, lifted off from the Baikonur Cosmodrome and hurled a 184-pound polished metal sphere into the heavens. Its name was Sputnik, fellow traveler. For 98 minutes it circled the globe, broadcasting a faint, pulsing signal. Beep, beep, beep. Amateur radio operators around the world picked it up. Newsrooms were thrown into chaos. It was the sound of a new age, and for the United States it was the sound of a profound and public humiliation. The reaction was not one of scientific wonder. It was one of deep, primordial fear. The Soviets, the supposedly backward, brutish communists, had beaten America into space. The nation that prided itself on its technological supremacy, its can-do ingenuity, had been lapped. The beeping satellite passing overhead was a constant, taunting reminder of this failure. A communist moon that looked down upon a suddenly vulnerable America. The public narrative, fanned by hysterical media coverage and opportunistic politicians, was apocalyptic. If they could put a satellite into orbit, they could put a hydrogen bomb on the tip of that same rocket and guide it to Chicago, or Los Angeles, or Washington, D.C. The bomber gap of the early 50s was instantly replaced by a far more terrifying concept: the missile gap. Democratic Senator Lyndon B. Johnson, whose subcommittee launched immediate, highly publicized hearings, called it a technological Pearl Harbor. The Soviets, it was claimed, were producing ICBMs like sausages, and America had nothing to answer them with. The country was defenseless. A wave of national self-doubt and panic swept the country. Schools were blamed for being too soft, children for being too lazy. Life magazine ran an article comparing the rigorous life of a Soviet high school student with the relaxed, easygoing life of his American counterpart. The implication was clear: America had lost its edge. This entire narrative of a missile gap, the central panic that would drive American policy for the next 4 years, was a deliberate, calculated fiction. And the man who knew it was a fiction better than anyone was President Dwight D. Eisenhower. While politicians screamed about Soviet superiority, Eisenhower remained outwardly and infuriatingly calm. He played golf. He downplayed the threat. His opponents painted him as a complacent, out-of-touch old man. In reality, he was in possession of the greatest secret of the Cold War. He knew, with a certainty that came from high-altitude photographs, that the Soviet missile program was a shambles. He had seen the proof, delivered by a top-secret program of high-flying spy planes. He knew the Soviets had only a handful of functional R-7 rockets, that they were wildly unreliable, and that they took hours to fuel on an open launch pad, making them useless as a first strike weapon. He knew the United States was, in fact, years ahead in bomber technology, nuclear warhead miniaturization, and was rapidly developing its own, far more sophisticated solid fuel missiles. There was no missile gap. The only gap was between the truth and the public panic. But the truth was an inconvenience for the powerful forces that Sputnik had unleashed. The panic was an opportunity, a golden ticket for the burgeoning military-industrial complex Eisenhower privately feared. The Air Force, the nascent aerospace industry, and their powerful allies in Congress used the missile gap to smash Eisenhower's fiscal conservatism. They lobbied, they leaked terrifying and false intelligence estimates, and they demanded a blank check to catch up to a threat they knew was exaggerated. It was the Korean War budget trick all over again, but this time, the enemy was an orbiting piece of metal. Uncomfortable. Quote, paraphrased from a letter from a major aerospace executive to a sympathetic senator on Johnson's Armed Services Committee, November 1957. Senator, this little satellite is the greatest gift Moscow has ever given us. Ike has been starving us for years with his balanced budgets and his talk of fiscal responsibility. He doesn't understand the new realities. Now the public understands. They can hear the threat beeping over their own homes. This isn't about numbers on a ledger anymore. It's about survival. The missile gap, whether it is real or not, is immaterial, has created the political will to fund the programs we've been pushing for a decade. The Atlas, the Titan, the Minuteman. This is the moment we build the arsenal of freedom. Sputnik has done more for our national defense budget in 1 month than we have been able to do in 5 years. We must not let this sense of crisis go to waste. And they didn't. The long-term consequences of the manufactured Sputnik panic were staggering. It gave birth to the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, in 1958. Not primarily as an agency of peaceful exploration, but as a civilian front for a high-stakes geopolitical contest to prove the superiority of the American system. It created the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA, pouring billions into the kind of high-risk, high-reward military technology that would eventually give us the internet, GPS, and stealth aircraft. It led to the National Defense Education Act, which pumped unprecedented federal funding into science and engineering programs, fundamentally reshaping American higher education around the needs of the national security state. And most dangerously, it locked the U.S. into a massive buildup of ICBMs to close the non-existent gap. When John F. Kennedy ran for president in 1960, he made the missile gap a centerpiece of his campaign. Once in office, his own intelligence confirmed the gap was a myth. It didn't matter. The missiles had already been ordered. By the mid-1960s, the U.S. had over 1,000 ICBMs. The Soviets, seeing this very real buildup, furiously worked to catch up. The fiction had created a new, far more terrifying reality, a world bristling with enough nuclear-tipped missiles on hair-trigger alert to extinguish human civilization, all because of a 184-pound sphere beeping its way across the autumn sky. That fiction of a missile gap, the ghost that justified a generation of military spending, was sustained by a lack of information. But in the halls of the White House, there was no such lack. President Eisenhower possessed a secret weapon in the war of information. a piece of technology so advanced it seemed to border on science fiction. It was a long, graceful, glider-like aircraft called the Lockheed U-2. Flying at altitudes of over 70,000 feet, more than 13 miles high on the very edge of space, the U-2 was, for a time, untouchable. Soviet radar couldn't track it, and their fighter jets couldn't reach it. From this godlike vantage point, its high-resolution cameras could photograph a newspaper headline on a Moscow street. And for 4 years, these planes, piloted by a handful of elite CIA aviators, crisscrossed the Soviet Union with impunity, mapping its military installations, counting its bombers, and, most importantly, looking for its missile sites. This was the source of Eisenhower's calm. The U-2 photographs told him the undeniable truth. The missile gap was a phantom. The Soviet ICBM program was a disorganized, primitive failure. But these flights were an act of extraordinary provocation, a profound and repeated violation of Soviet sovereignty. Eisenhower knew the risk. Each flight was a roll of the dice. If a U-2 was ever brought down, it would be an international incident of the highest order, proof of American espionage that could not be denied. By the end of his second term, with the memory of Sputnik still raw, Eisenhower was looking for a legacy beyond the arms race. A fragile thaw had begun. Nikita Khrushchev, for all his bluster, was also looking for a way to ease the crushing burden of military spending on his economy. He began speaking of peaceful coexistence. In 1959, he made a historic trip to the United States, visiting a Hollywood movie set and an Iowa corn farm, creating a brief, surreal moment of goodwill known as the Spirit of Camp David. A major four-power summit was scheduled for Paris in May of 1960. There was genuine hope in the air. A nuclear test ban treaty was on the table. A real de-escalation seemed possible for the first time. This prospect of peace was, of course, terrifying to the hardliners on both sides. For the Soviet military and the ideologues in Beijing, Khrushchev's talk of coexistence sounded like weakness, a betrayal of the revolution. For the American military-industrial complex, a successful summit would be a disaster for the budget. Peace was bad for business. Against his better judgment and under pressure from the CIA to get one last look at a suspected new missile site, Eisenhower authorized one final U-2 flight. It was to be the last one. The pilot was a 30-year-old former Air Force captain named Francis Gary Powers. On May 1, 1960, May Day, the great Soviet holiday, Powers took off from a base in Pakistan, his flight plan a 3,800-mile journey across the heart of the Soviet Union, landing in Norway. Over the industrial city of Sverdlovsk, his luck, and Eisenhower's, ran out. A volley of newly developed Soviet surface-to-air missiles exploded near his fragile aircraft. He managed to bail out as the U-2 spiraled toward the Earth. In Washington, the cover story was already prepared. NASA issued a press release. One of its high-altitude weather research aircraft on a flight over Turkey had experienced oxygen difficulties. The pilot had likely lost consciousness, and the plane had strayed off course. It was a plausible lie, built on one crucial assumption, that the pilot was dead and the plane had been obliterated in the crash. For 4 days, the Soviets were silent. The Eisenhower administration elaborated on its lie, providing reporters with detailed charts of the supposed weather flight. Then, on May 5th, Khrushchev sprang his trap. In a dramatic speech to the Supreme Soviet, he revealed the truth. "I must tell you a secret," he began, a wicked gleam in his eye. "When I was making my report, I deliberately did not say that the pilot is alive and well." He then produced the wreckage of the plane, the spy camera, and the photographs it had taken of Soviet military sites. And then the final, devastating blow. They had the pilot, Francis Gary Powers, alive, conscious, and confessing. President Eisenhower, the great war hero, the symbol of American integrity, had been caught, red-handed, in a clumsy, bald-faced lie on the world stage. Classified memo. Paraphrased from a private communication between the Soviet Minister of Defense and the head of the KGB's first chief directorate, May 7, 1960. Subject: the Paris situation. "This is the gift we needed. The chairman's dalliance with coexistence has been a dangerous distraction. It has made us look soft to the Chinese and has emboldened the revisionists in our own bloc. Now, this American provocation has destroyed his credibility as a partner for peace. He cannot go to Paris and shake the hand of the man who sent spies over our motherland. He will be forced to take a hard line. He will have to demand an apology he knows they cannot give. The summit will collapse. There will be no test ban treaty. There will be no reduction in forces. This incident allows us to reassert the fundamental truth of the struggle. There can be no peace with the imperialists. Their nature is to deceive and attack. The chairman wanted to talk. Now he must pound his fist. The army will get its new missiles. The party will get its ideological clarity back. The pilot has done us a great service. The sabotage was complete. The downing of the U-2 didn't just expose a spy plane. It was weaponized by hardliners on both sides to kill the nascent détente. Khrushchev arrived in Paris full of bluster and rage. He could do nothing else. To do less would have been to confirm the accusations of weakness from his rivals in the Kremlin and from Mao in Beijing. He demanded that Eisenhower publicly apologize for the flights, punish those responsible, and promise it would never happen again. Eisenhower, humiliated and cornered, refused to be publicly flagellated. He would only agree to suspend the flights. It was not enough. Khrushchev stormed out of the preliminary meeting, the summit officially torpedoed before it even began. The long-term consequences were immediate and severe. The spirit of Camp David was dead, replaced by a renewed atmosphere of bitterness and mistrust. The brief window for a comprehensive test ban treaty slammed shut, and both sides would continue to test ever more powerful nuclear weapons in the atmosphere for years to come. The arms race, which had briefly seemed capable of being managed, was now back on, with a vengeance. The incident didn't cause the Cold War, but it ensured its continuation, deliberately wrecking the first real off-ramp that had appeared in a decade. The path was now clear for the series of terrifying confrontations that would define the early 1960s, from the building of the Berlin Wall to the Cuban Missile Crisis itself. Peace had been sabotaged. The wreckage of the Paris summit and the U-2 incident did more than just restart the arms race. It poisoned the well of international politics. Trust was gone. The grand stage of superpower negotiation was closed for renovations. The Cold War, denied an outlet in diplomacy, went searching for new, hotter battlefields. It found them in the chaotic, hopeful, and fatally vulnerable nations of the post-colonial world. The process of decolonization was supposed to be a triumph of self-determination. In reality, it became a brutal talent show, where newly independent nations were judged on a single criterion: their loyalty in the great superpower struggle. And the first contestant to be violently voted off the island was a man who dared to believe that independence meant independence. His name was Patrice Lumumba, and his country, the Congo, was the prize. On June 30th, 1960, the Belgian Congo, a vast territory in the heart of Africa, exploited with a barbarity that had shocked even other colonial powers, became a free nation. It was a moment of immense promise. The country was a treasure chest of strategic resources: diamonds, cobalt, copper, and most critically the high-grade uranium from the Shinkolobwe mine in its southern province of Katanga. The very uranium that had filled the cores of the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Congo's first democratically elected prime minister was Patrice Lumumba, a former postal clerk and beer salesman who had become a fiery, charismatic, and uncompromising Pan-African nationalist. At the independence ceremony in front of the Belgian king, Lumumba delivered a speech that was not on the approved program. Instead of the expected platitudes of gratitude, he spoke of the tears, fire, and blood of colonialism. He spoke of justice. In that single defiant speech, he signed his own death warrant. To the West, and particularly to the old colonial masters in Brussels and the new ones in Washington, Lumumba was not a patriot. He was a problem. He was unpredictable, emotional, and worst of all, he was serious about economic independence. He believed the Congo's fabulous mineral wealth should belong to the Congolese people. This was a direct threat to the powerful Belgian mining interests that intended to continue their plunder, independence or not. The crisis ignited almost immediately. The army mutinied. Belgium, under the pretext of protecting its citizens, sent its troops back in, but their real objective was to secure Katanga. With Belgian backing, a corrupt local politician named Moise Tshombe declared Katanga an independent state, effectively ripping the treasure chest out of the new nation's hands. Lumumba, his country fragmenting, appealed to the United Nations for help to expel the Belgian troops and end the secession. The UN sent peacekeepers, but, operating under a weak mandate, they refused to intervene in the internal matter of Katanga. Lumumba was trapped. The West, through the UN, was offering him a chair at the table, while its corporate interests were sawing the legs off his country. He made the one move a nationalist leader in the Third World could make, the move that was a guaranteed trigger for Western intervention. He asked the Soviet Union for help. He requested trucks, planes, and technical assistance to put down the rebellion. For the Eisenhower administration, this was the final proof. It didn't matter that Lumumba was not a communist. It didn't matter that his cabinet was full of moderates. By turning to Moscow, he had chosen a side. He had become, in the chillingly detached language of the era, a negative factor. He was a loose cannon on the deck of a ship loaded with uranium, and he had to be removed. Classified memo from the CIA station chief in Leopoldville, now Kinshasa, to the Director of Central Intelligence, Alan Dulles, August 1960. Subject: the Lumumba problem and proposed final solution. We are not dealing with a trained Marxist. We are dealing with something far more dangerous, a man who believes his own rhetoric. His appeal to the Soviets is not ideological. It is an act of desperation. However, the consequence is the same. Soviet technicians on the ground, Soviet influence in the central government, potential Soviet access to strategic minerals. This is a contingency we cannot permit. Waiting for him to formally align with the bloc is a risk we don't need to take. The president has made it clear that Lumumba is a threat to the vital interests of the free world. This is not a situation that can be managed or contained. It requires a permanent removal. The political structures here are fragile. A decisive, covert action to eliminate the primary vector of infection can secure the state for our assets, specifically Colonel Mobutu. This is a matter of geopolitical hygiene. The hygiene was administered with ruthless efficiency. The CIA station chief was authorized $100,000 to arrange the assassination. Plots were hatched involving poisoned toothpaste and a hired European sharpshooter. But in the end, the job was subcontracted. The CIA identified and cultivated a young, ambitious Congolese army officer, Colonel Joseph Désiré Mobutu. With Western backing, Mobutu launched a coup in September, placing Lumumba under house arrest. In January 1961, Mobutu's forces handed Lumumba over to their and his mortal enemies, the secessionist authorities in Katanga, who were advised by Belgian officers. Lumumba and two of his associates were flown to Elizabethville, beaten mercilessly on the flight, and then led to a clearing in the woods where they were executed by a firing squad commanded by a Belgian officer. To hide the crime, a Belgian police commissioner and his brother later dug up the bodies, hacked them to pieces, and dissolved them in sulfuric acid. The long-term consequence of this successful operation was the creation of a failed state. The West got what it wanted. Patrice Lumumba was erased, and their man, Mobutu, was installed. Mobutu would rule the Congo, which he renamed Zaire, for the next 32 years as one of the most corrupt and brutal kleptocrats in modern history, a loyal anti-communist who looted his nation of billions while his people starved. The assassination became a martyr's story, a foundational myth of neo-colonial betrayal that fueled anti-Western movements across Africa for decades. The United States and its allies had proven that the promise of independence was a conditional gift, one that could be violently revoked if the recipient didn't play by their rules. The assassination of Patrice Lumumba was a squalid affair, a geopolitical contract killing disguised as an internal power struggle. It was a perfect example of the Cold War's dirty work, carried out in the shadows and designed to be denied. But just a few months before Lumumba was dragged from his plane to his death, another far more spectacular act of state-sponsored kidnapping took place, an operation that was not meant to be denied but to be broadcast to the entire world. This was not a story of ambiguous motives and murky alliances. This was a tale of seemingly absolute moral clarity, a hunt for a monster. And yet, beneath the righteous surface of justice served, lay a political calculation as cold and as pragmatic as any CIA coup. The target was a balding, bespectacled, middle-aged man living a quiet life in a suburb of Buenos Aires. His name was Ricardo Clement. His real name was Adolf Eichmann. By 1960, most of the major Nazi war criminals were dead, had been tried at Nuremberg, or had vanished into the woodwork of a world eager to forget. Eichmann was different. He was not a frothing demagogue or a battlefield general. He was the bureaucrat of death, the logistical genius, the man who organized the timetables for the trains that carried millions to the gas chambers of Auschwitz and Treblinka. He was the personification of Hannah Arendt's future phrase, the banality of evil. He was the ultimate mid-level manager of the Holocaust, and for 15 years he had lived a life of quiet obscurity, first in Germany, then Italy, finally settling in Argentina under a false name, working at a Mercedes-Benz factory. He was a ghost the world had given up on finding, but the new state of Israel had not. The story of his capture is the stuff of spy thrillers, meticulous intelligence work by the Mossad, Israel's fledgling intelligence agency, a team of agents dispatched to Buenos Aires living undercover, surveilling the humble house on Garibaldi Street. The dramatic abduction on the evening of May 11, 1960, when a team led by the legendary Rafi Eitan snatched Eichmann off the street as he got off a bus, wrestling him into a car and holding him in a safe house. The sheer audacity of sedating him, dressing him in the uniform of an El Al flight attendant, and smuggling him out of Argentina on a commercial flight, a flagrant violation of another nation's sovereignty. 9 days later, on May 23rd, Israeli Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion stood before the Knesset and announced to a stunned world, Adolf Eichmann was in Israel, and he would stand trial for his crimes against the Jewish people. The public narrative was one of pure, unassailable justice. This was not about revenge, Ben-Gurion insisted, but about a historical reckoning. For the first time, the story of the Holocaust would be told in a court of law, not by prosecutors, but by the survivors themselves. The trial in Jerusalem, which began in April 1961, was a global media event, a televised seminar on the mechanics of genocide. For months, the world watched as a parade of witnesses, survivors with numbers tattooed on their arms, recounted horrors that defied imagination. Eichmann sat in a bulletproof glass box, a seemingly ordinary man, a clerk, who had shuffled the papers that had annihilated a civilization. It was a profound and necessary act of historical memory. It was also a brilliant piece of political theater, uncomfortable. Quote, attributed to Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion in a private strategy session with Mossad Chief Isser Harel. The world wants to see this as a legal proceeding. Let them. The law is a useful stage, but we are not building a legal case. We are building a nation. Our young people, the Sabras born here, they do not understand the Shoah. They see the Jews of Europe as sheep led to the slaughter. They must understand what was lost, so they know what they are fighting to protect. The trial will be their schoolroom. And for our neighbors? For Nasser and his friends who speak of driving us into the sea? This is a different lesson. This operation tells them that the arm of the Jewish state is long. It can reach into any country, on any continent, and take our enemies. We are no longer the victims who plead for justice from others. We are the power that delivers it ourselves. Eichmann's life is forfeit. His capture, however, is an investment in our future. Ben-Gurion's calculation was threefold. First, the trial was an act of national pedagogy. Israel in 1960 was a nation of traumatized refugees and a new generation of native-born Israelis who often viewed the diaspora Jews with a mixture of pity and contempt. The trial was designed to stitch these two halves of the national soul together, to forge a shared identity out of the ashes of the Holocaust, making it the central foundational trauma of the new state. It was to teach the young that the state of Israel was the only answer to the eternal vulnerability of the Jewish people. Second, the capture was a radical declaration of sovereignty. By abducting Eichmann, Israel was deliberately flouting international law and the norms of diplomacy. It was a statement that when it came to crimes against the Jewish people, Israel answered to no higher authority. It was the sole guardian of its people's history and the sole executor of its justice. The world had failed to protect them. Israel would now protect itself by any means necessary. Finally, and most importantly, it was a warning. It was the public unveiling of the Mossad as an instrument of global reach and lethal power. The message to the Arab world, which was then openly hostile and threatening Israel's existence, was unmistakable. There is no hiding place. We will find you. The Eichmann operation established the mythos of Israeli intelligence: brilliant, daring, and utterly ruthless. The long-term consequence was the successful branding of the new state. The trial did educate the world, and it did help solidify Israeli national identity, but it also sanctified the act of extrajudicial killing and abduction as a legitimate tool of statecraft for Israel. The ghost of Eichmann would be invoked to justify a half-century of targeted assassinations, kidnappings, and covert operations far murkier than the seemingly clear-cut case of a Nazi monster. Justice had been served, but it had also been weaponized. The Mossad's spectacular success in Buenos Aires was a masterclass in the new rules of sovereignty. For a nation that felt its existence was at stake, there were no rules. It was a lesson the American Central Intelligence Agency believed it had perfected. After Iran and Guatemala, the agency was suffused with a dangerous, intoxicating hubris. They were the secret masters of the universe, the kingmakers and government breakers, a force of history that operated beyond the reach of law or public scrutiny. This institutional arrogance was about to collide with a new young president and a charismatic revolutionary just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. The result would be the agency's most spectacular and defining failure, a fiasco so perfectly complete that it looked less like a botched operation and more like a carefully designed trap. The target was Fidel Castro. His revolution in 1959, which had overthrown the corrupt US-backed dictator Fulgencio Batista, was initially a source of confusion in Washington. But as Castro consolidated power, executed his opponents, and began nationalizing American-owned sugar plantations and oil refineries, the picture sharpened. He was a threat, an agent of chaos, and worst of all, an example. He was defying the Monroe Doctrine in America's own Caribbean swimming pool. By 1960, the Eisenhower administration had approved a CIA plan to remove him. It was the Guatemala model, scaled up: find a pliable exile leader, train a proxy army, and use a combination of psychological warfare and covert force to trigger a counter-revolution. The CIA established secret training camps in Guatemala for a force of 1,400 anti-Castro Cuban exiles who became known as Brigade 2506. The operation was codenamed Pluto, later Zapata. In January 1961, John F. Kennedy inherited this ticking bomb. The new president was young, handsome, and publicly projected an image of hawkish Cold War resolve. Privately, he was skeptical of the CIA's old guard. Men like Director Allen Dulles and the operations architect Richard Bissell. He was wary of their can-do swagger and their simplistic worldview. He approved the invasion plan, but with one critical and ultimately fatal caveat. There could be no overt U.S. military involvement. The American hand had to remain hidden. He wanted, and desperately needed, plausible deniability. He canceled a second, more effective round of airstrikes against Castro's Air Force and moved the landing site from the city of Trinidad, which had a better chance of sparking an uprising, to a remote, swampy, and tactically indefensible inlet on the southern coast of Cuba, the Bay of Pigs. Here lies the dark heart of the conspiracy, the uncomfortable question that has haunted the operation for over 60 years. Was it designed to fail? The CIA's planners, Bissell and Dulles, were not fools. They were veterans of the game. They knew that a 1,400-man brigade, landing with minimal air cover in a tactically hopeless location, stood no chance against Castro's 200,000-man army, unless two things happened: a massive, spontaneous uprising of the Cuban people and direct, overwhelming U.S. military support. The intelligence reports assuring Kennedy that the Cuban people were ready to rise up were, to put it mildly, fantastically optimistic. In reality, Castro was at the peak of his popularity. So why proceed? The cynical interpretation, whispered by disillusioned insiders and later pieced together by historians, is that the plan was never meant to succeed on its own terms. It was a trigger. It was a trap for the new president. The old guard at the agency believed that once the brave Cuban exiles trained and funded by the U.S. were on the beach, fighting and dying for a cause America had sponsored, no American president could possibly abandon them. Kennedy's hand would be forced. He would have to send in the Marines. He would have to authorize the airstrikes from the U.S. Navy carriers waiting just over the horizon. The CIA was not just launching an invasion, it was trying to bounce a president into a war he didn't want. Uncomfortable. Quote, internal monologue of a veteran CIA planner, Richard Bissell, as he briefs the Kennedy team, a fictional reconstruction based on his known worldview. They don't get it. The president, his brother, all these bright boys from Harvard. They think this is a surgical operation. They want guarantees and deniability. They're trying to have a virgin birth. War is messy. You can't start a fire and then complain about the smoke. The plan, as it stands on paper with his restrictions, will fail. We all know it. But the plan on paper is not the real plan. The real plan is to get the brigade onto the beach. They are the sacrificial lambs. They are the tripwire. Once American prestige is committed, once those boys are bleeding in the surf, this academic debate about plausible deniability will evaporate. The president will be faced with a choice not between intervention and non-intervention, but between a humiliating defeat and victory. No Kennedy will ever choose humiliation. The brigade is not the army of liberation. They are the bait. On April 17, 1961, the bait was taken. The invasion was a catalog of disasters from the first minute. Castro knew they were coming. The element of surprise was zero. The initial limited airstrikes had failed to destroy his air force, leaving his handful of T-33 jets free to dominate the skies over the beachhead, sinking the brigade's supply ships. The coral reefs, which the CIA's maps had failed to note, tore up the landing craft. The invading force was pinned down on the beach, their backs to the sea, surrounded by Castro's vastly superior forces. The popular uprising was a fantasy. The Cuban people rallied to defend their homeland from what they saw, correctly, as a Yankee-backed invasion. The desperate calls came into the White House, authorized the airstrikes, unleashed the jets from the Essex. The trap had been sprung. And in the most crucial decision of his young presidency, John F. Kennedy refused to walk into it. Furious that he had been misled and manipulated, he chose humiliation over escalation. He let it fail. Within 72 hours, it was over. The brigade was crushed. The long-term consequences were a geopolitical earthquake. Fidel Castro, the bearded revolutionary, was transformed into a global icon, the man who had faced down the Goliath and won. He was pushed irrevocably into the arms of the Soviet Union, who now had a committed revolutionary ally 90 miles from American shores. Kennedy, publicly humiliated, fired Allen Dulles and his top deputies, creating a lasting and bitter enmity between the presidency and the intelligence community. But most importantly, the Bay of Pigs created a psychological imperative. Kennedy felt he had been perceived as weak, indecisive, and naive. He could not afford another such defeat. The next time he confronted Khrushchev, he would have to be tough. He would have to draw a hard line. The humiliating ghost of the Bay of Pigs would hover over every decision made 18 months later, when American spy planes discovered a new and far more dangerous secret being unloaded on the island of Cuba. The smoking wreckage of Brigade 2506 on the beaches of the Bay of Pigs was more than a military defeat. It was a character assessment. In the Kremlin, Nikita Khrushchev, the master of reading weakness, believed he now had the measure of the new American president. John F. Kennedy was not a hardened general like Eisenhower. He was an intellectual, a talker, a man who had blinked when the pressure was on. The failed invasion had emboldened Khrushchev. He saw an opportunity to push, to test the resolve of this young, seemingly indecisive leader. He chose to apply that pressure at the most sensitive, nerve-jangling point in the entire global standoff, the festering wound of Berlin. The city was still a geopolitical absurdity, but by 1961, it had become something more dangerous, a gaping hole in the Iron Curtain. While the borders between East and West Germany were sealed, Berlin remained open. It was a simple matter for an East German to take a subway from the Soviet sector into the West, register as a refugee, and be flown out to a new life. And they were leaving in droves. This was not a trickle, it was a hemorrhage. By 1961, nearly 3 million East Germans, a sixth of the country's population, had fled to the West. Crucially, these were not just random citizens, they were the best and the brightest. The doctors, the engineers, the teachers, the skilled technicians, the very people the German Democratic Republic needed to build its socialist paradise. The East German state was bleeding to death, and its leader, the hardline Stalinist Walter Ulbricht, was screaming at Moscow to do something, to plug the drain. For the West, it was a massive propaganda victory, proof that people would literally run from communism. It was also a massive logistical nightmare, creating a chaotic and destabilizing refugee crisis. In June 1961, Kennedy and Khrushchev met for their first and only summit in Vienna. The atmosphere was brutal. Khrushchev, sensing weakness, treated the young president with open contempt. He harangued him, bullied him, and renewed his threat to sign a separate peace treaty with East Germany, an act that would extinguish Western occupation rights and hand control of the access routes to West Berlin over to the volatile East German regime. He gave Kennedy a 6-month ultimatum. Get out of Berlin or face the consequences. It is up to the US now to decide whether there will be war or peace, Khrushchev bluntly stated. Kennedy left the meeting shaken to his core, believing the world was on a collision course for nuclear war. He now understood that the Berlin crisis was not a problem to be managed, but a confrontation to be survived. The world held its breath, waiting for the Soviet move. It came in the dead of night. In the early hours of Sunday, August 13, 1961, East German troops and factory militias began to unspool miles of barbed wire, tearing up streets and erecting concrete posts, sealing the border between East and West Berlin. The S-Bahn and U-Bahn lines were severed. The city was cut in two. The public reaction in the West was one of universal shock and horror. It was a monstrous, inhuman act. Families were separated with no warning. Children playing on one side of a street were suddenly trapped, unable to go home. It was the ultimate admission of failure by the communist system, that it could only keep its people by building a prison around them. The Wall of Shame, as West Berlin's mayor Willy Brandt immediately dubbed it, became the most powerful and enduring symbol of totalitarian oppression. This is the official story, and it is true, as far as it goes. But behind the scenes, in the Western chancelleries, the primary emotion was not outrage. It was relief, a deep, profound, and utterly cynical wave of relief. Classified memo from the U.S. ambassador in Bonn to the Secretary of State in Washington, August 15, 1961. Subject: Assessment of the Berlin sector closure. The public statements of condemnation are, of course, necessary and will continue. The propaganda value of this wall of shame is a gift of the first order, and we will exploit it for decades. It is a stark visual admission of their system's bankruptcy. However, in private, we must assess this event for what it is: a crude but effective stabilization of a crisis that was rapidly spinning out of control. Ulbricht has plugged his refugee drain, which, while a human tragedy, removes the immediate catalyst for his increasingly desperate demands on Moscow. More importantly, Khrushchev has revealed his hand. He has chosen not to seize West Berlin, not to choke our access, not to force a military confrontation he might well have won. He has instead chosen to imprison his own subjects. It is an ugly solution, but it is a solution. It addresses his core problem without directly challenging our core interests. We have lost face, perhaps, but we have not lost Berlin. A wall, sir, is a hell of a lot better than a war. The ultimatum is over. The crisis is contained. Kennedy's private reaction mirrored this cold logic. He knew he couldn't stop it without starting a war, and he had no intention of trading millions of American lives for free access between the two halves of Berlin. The American response was deliberately theatrical and militarily insignificant. A small battle group was sent down the Autobahn to reinforce the Berlin garrison. Vice President Lyndon Johnson was flown in to give speeches. The message was clear: we will defend West Berlin, but we will do nothing about East Berlin. The wall, this brutal concrete scar, had solved everyone's problem. It stopped the brain drain that was killing East Germany. It ended the refugee crisis that was straining West Germany. And for the superpowers, it drew a clear, unambiguous line. It solidified the status quo. It was ugly, but it was stable. The long-term consequence was the physical embodiment of the Cold War for the next 28 years. It became a killing field, where over 100 people would die trying to cross to freedom. It was a daily reminder of the division of a continent and a world. But in the perverse logic of 1961, its construction was not the start of a war, but the end of one. It closed the book on the Berlin crisis, freeing both Kennedy and Khrushchev to turn their full, undivided attention to the next, and far more dangerous chapter of their rivalry, which was already brewing in the warm waters of the Caribbean. The Berlin Wall, for all its brutality, had brought a cold, hard clarity to the European theater. The lines were drawn in concrete and barbed wire. But the Kennedy administration, and particularly the president and his brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, were not looking at Europe. Their gaze was fixed with a burning, obsessive intensity on the small island 90 miles to the south. The humiliation of the Bay of Pigs was a personal wound, a stain on the family's honor and the nation's prestige. It demanded a reckoning. Kennedy had refused to walk into the CIA's trap and escalate the failed invasion, but that decision had come at a price.
Now, a new, far darker and more protracted war would be waged, a war in the shadows, a campaign of vengeance so relentless and bizarre it often bordered on the insane. It was called Operation Mongoose. Officially, Mongoose was a coordinated multi-agency program with the stated goal of fomenting a popular uprising in Cuba that would overthrow the Castro regime.
It was placed under the personal, obsessive supervision of Robert Kennedy, who ran the meetings with a ruthless, driving impatience. He made it clear to the CIA, the Pentagon, and the State Department that this was the administration's top priority. Nothing was off the table. The public face of Mongoose, or rather, the face that would later be revealed in sensational Senate hearings, was a carnival of absurdity, a collection of assassination plots so outlandish they seemed conceived by a pulp novelist. These were the infamous executive action capabilities, the plots to physically eliminate Fidel Castro. The list is a testament to an agency unmoored from reality. Its vast resources and technical ingenuity devoted to schemes of cartoonish villainy. There was the plan to contaminate a box of Castro's favorite cigars with botulinum toxin, a poison so potent it would kill him before he could put the cigar down. There was the idea of planting an exploding seashell, painted with lurid, alluring colors at a spot where Castro was known to go skin diving. There was the plot to gift him a diving suit dusted on the inside with a fungus that would cause a chronic skin disease and contaminated with tuberculosis bacteria in the breathing apparatus. They considered a poison pen, a hypodermic needle so fine that a CIA asset could accidentally bump into Castro and inject him with a deadly toxin without him ever noticing. The madness reached its zenith with the decision to subcontract the assassination to the one group of people who hated Castro as much as the CIA did, the American Mafia, whose lucrative casino and brothel businesses in Havana had been shut down by the revolution. The CIA made contact with mob bosses Sam Giancana and Santo Trafficante Jr., figures on the FBI's most wanted list, to arrange a classic mob hit on a foreign head of state. These plots were not just brainstorming sessions, they were active operations. Poisons were manufactured, contacts were made, devices were built. But their very absurdity served as a kind of mask, a layer of macabre comedy that concealed the true nature of Operation Mongoose. The real war wasn't about exploding seashells. It was a deadly serious, large-scale campaign of state-sponsored terrorism. Uncomfortable. Quote, paraphrased from Robert F. Kennedy's remarks at a tense Operation Mongoose review meeting, early 1962. I am not interested in your excuses. I am not interested in your bureaucratic turf wars. I read the reports. Every week we are making progress, and every week he is still there, laughing at us. The president's prestige and the credibility of the United States are on the line. We were humiliated at the Bay of Pigs. That cannot stand. We are in a war with this man, And we are losing. I don't care if you have to use the goddamn mafia. I don't care if you have to call down the wrath of God. But something has to give. I want you to think like he does. I want you to be on the streets of Miami and in the fields of Cuba. I want disruption. I want noise. I want him to know every single day when he wakes up that our reach is long and our memory is longer. We need to be doing more. This is the top priority. Do you understand? More. The more that RFK demanded was the heart of the operation. Mongoose was a campaign designed to make Cuba scream. CIA-backed exile groups operating out of Florida and Central America launched hundreds of paramilitary raids on the Cuban coast. They machine-gunned seaside hotels. They blew up bridges and power plants. They set fire to sugarcane fields and warehouses, the core of the Cuban economy. Agents on the island contaminated shipments of sugar destined for the Soviet Union. They introduced agricultural pests to ruin crops. It was a program of total economic and psychological warfare, designed to make daily life so unbearable for the average Cuban that they would rise up and overthrow the man responsible. The goal was to create chaos, to break the country's spirit, to prove that the revolution had failed to provide even the most basic security and sustenance for its people. The long-term consequence of this relentless campaign of terror was as predictable as it was catastrophic. It did not turn the Cuban people against Castro. On the contrary, it gave him the perfect foil, a clear and present enemy against which he could rally patriotic fervor and justify his own repressive measures. Every act of sabotage was proof of Yankee aggression, but far more dangerously, it sent a clear and unambiguous message to both Fidel Castro and his patrons in the Kremlin. The United States was not just posturing, it was actively trying to destroy the Cuban Revolution and kill its leader. From Havana and Moscow, Operation Mongoose did not look like a series of pranks and pinprick raids. It looked like the prelude to another invasion, a full-scale American assault that this time would not fail. Castro and Khrushchev came to a logical, if terrifying, conclusion. Cuba needed a deterrent. It needed an insurance policy so powerful that the United States would never dare to invade. In the summer of 1962, that insurance policy, in the form of Soviet medium-range ballistic missiles, began to make its way across the Atlantic in the holds of disguised cargo ships. The bizarre plots of Operation Mongoose hadn't killed Castro. They had planted the seeds of Armageddon. The chickens from Operation Mongoose, those bizarre, venomous plots hatched in the back rooms of Langley, were coming home to roost, and they were roosting on missile launchers. The official canonized story begins on the morning of Tuesday, October 16, 1962. National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy walks into President Kennedy's bedroom at the White House carrying a thin folder. Inside are the photographs. Taken 2 days earlier by a U-2 spy plane on a high-altitude pass over western Cuba, the images are grainy but unmistakable. In the cleared jungle clearings near San Cristobal, the expert analysts have identified the distinctive star-shaped layout of a launch site for Soviet SS-4 medium-range ballistic missiles. They are nuclear-capable. They can reach Washington, D.C., Dallas, or Cape Canaveral in minutes. The warning time is effectively zero. This is the moment the world is told the Cold War turned hot, the moment the abyss stared back. For 13 days, the world would hold its breath as two young, determined leaders stood, in the famous phrase, eyeball to eyeball. The narrative is one of heroic crisis management, of a cool-headed president and his team of the best and the brightest steering the ship of state through the storm of an unprovoked, reckless Soviet gamble. Khrushchev, the story goes, had decided to secretly sneak nuclear weapons into America's backyard, a gangster move designed to terrorize the United States and alter the global balance of power in a single, audacious stroke. The discovery of the missiles is presented as a thunderclap, a bolt from the blue, the shocking revelation of a profound betrayal. But was it a surprise? Was it really an unprovoked act of aggression? Or was it an answer? Was it the predictable, logical, and perhaps even inevitable countermove in a game the Kennedy administration had started? The truth, buried beneath a half-century of heroic myth-making, is that the Cuban Missile Crisis was not a surprise. It was a reaping. It was the culmination of a series of escalations that the Kennedy White House had actively and relentlessly provoked. let us return to the perspective of Moscow and Havana, a perspective conveniently edited out of the American version of events. For 2 years, they had been the targets of a sustained campaign of American aggression. They had witnessed the Bay of Pigs, a clear statement of intent. They were living through Operation Mongoose, a daily reality of sabotage, coastal raids, and credible assassination plots against their entire leadership. American military exercises in the Caribbean, with names like Ortsac, Castro spelled backwards, openly simulated an invasion of the island. From Castro's point of view, a full-scale American invasion was not a question of if, but when. His nation was under siege. For Khrushchev, the situation was equally dire. His new Cuban ally, his only foothold in the Western Hemisphere, was about to be snuffed out. A profound humiliation for the Soviet Union on the world stage. They needed a deterrent. They needed something that would make Kennedy think twice. But the decision was not just about defending Cuba. It was about the strategic balance of the entire world. In 1961, the United States had quietly, but with lethal seriousness, deployed 15 nuclear-tipped PGM-19 Jupiter missiles to Turkey, right on the Soviet Union's southern border. These were not secure second-strike weapons buried in silos. They were liquid-fueled, highly vulnerable, above-ground missiles that took hours to prepare for launch. In the cold calculus of nuclear strategy, this made them useful for only one thing: a first strike. From their launch pads in Turkey, they could obliterate Moscow and other key Soviet cities in less than 10 minutes. For Khrushchev, this was a knife held permanently to his throat, an existential threat that negated his own nation's massive but slow, land-based arsenal. Uncomfortable. Quote, a fictionalized but historically grounded conversation between Khrushchev and Soviet Defense Minister Rodion Malinovsky, spring 1962. Nikita Sergeyevich, the Americans do not respect us. They see your talk of coexistence as weakness. They put their missiles in Turkey, a pistol to our head, and expect us to do nothing. They try to strangle our Cuban friends. They are squeezing us from both sides. We have a conventional superiority in Europe, but what good is it? They have us checkmated, but Cuba is their Turkey. It is the same move, on the same board, just in the opposite direction. Putting our missiles there is not an act of war. It is an act of balance. It will be a shock, yes. They will scream. But for the first time, they will feel what we feel every single day. The fear, the vulnerability. It will not lead to war. It will lead to a conversation. We will give them their little island security, and they will take their pistol away from our head. It is the only language they will understand. This was the true game. The missile deployment to Cuba, codenamed Operation Anadir, was a direct, symmetrical response to the Jupiter missiles in Turkey. It was Khrushchev's attempt to give the Americans, in his own earthy phrase, a little of their own medicine. He knew the missiles would be discovered. The entire operation, with dozens of ships and thousands of personnel, was too big to hide forever. The discovery was not the failure of the plan, it was the plan. It was the only way to force the Kennedy administration to the negotiating table to discuss the removal of the Turkish missiles and to guarantee the sovereignty of Cuba. The long-term consequence of this profound misunderstanding, or deliberate misrepresentation of Soviet motives, was the creation of the heroic Kennedy myth. He was portrayed as the man who stared down an irrational aggressor, when in fact, he was a man trapped in a crisis of his own making, forced to find a way out of a bear trap he had baited himself. The 13 days were not a sudden storm from a clear sky. They were the hurricane that is born when one side relentlessly pushes the wind in one direction, and is then shocked when it finally begins to blow back. So the trap was set. Khrushchev's missiles, his little bit of medicine, were now sitting in the Cuban jungle, and Kennedy's U-2s had the pictures to prove it. The president convened a top-secret crisis group that would become known as the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, or EXCOM. For days in the stuffy confines of the cabinet room, the most powerful men in the world debated the fate of civilization. The public story of these meetings, carefully curated for history, is one of cool reason prevailing over hot-headed aggression. It was a debate between the Hawks, led by the military chiefs who demanded an immediate massive airstrike followed by an invasion, and the Doves, led by Robert Kennedy and Defense Secretary Robert McNamara, who argued for a more measured diplomatic approach. The president, we are told, listened to all sides and wisely chose the middle path. Not an act of war, but a quarantine. This entire framework is a masterpiece of political theater. The quarantine was not a middle path. It was stagecraft. A naval blockade is an act of war under international law. Calling it a quarantine was a stroke of public relations genius, transforming an aggressive military maneuver into something that sounded sterile, defensive, and almost medical, as if Cuba were a diseased patient to be isolated. On the evening of October 22, 1962, President Kennedy went on national television and delivered the speech of his life. In grave, somber tones, he revealed the existence of the missiles to the American people and the world. He announced the quarantine line around Cuba. He demanded that Khrushchev dismantle the bases and remove the weapons. He had drawn a line in the water. The gauntlet had been thrown down. It was a performance of magnificent, steely resolve. It was also a bluff, a public posture designed to buy time for the real game, which was not being played by admirals on the high seas, but by a handful of men in secret back-channel conversations. The ships of the U.S. Navy steaming toward their stations in the Caribbean were not the main actors. They were props in a global drama. The real stage was a series of clandestine meetings between the president's brother, Robert Kennedy, and the Soviet ambassador to the United States, Anatoly Dobrynin. While XCOM debated apocalyptic scenarios and the media broadcast terrifying images of American military readiness, the two men were engaged in a desperate, frantic negotiation to find a way out of the corner both of their leaders had painted themselves into. Khrushchev had sent a flurry of conflicting messages to Washington. One, a long, emotional, rambling letter offering to remove the missiles in exchange for a non-invasion pledge. Another, more formal letter adding the demand for the removal of the Jupiter missiles from Turkey. The Hawks in XCOM seized on the second, harder-line letter as proof of Soviet duplicity. But Kennedy knew better. He understood that the Turkey missiles, the ones his own administration had provoked this crisis over, were the key. This was the core of the dilemma. Kennedy could not, under any circumstances, be seen to be trading away an ally's defenses under Soviet threat. The Jupiter missiles were technically under NATO command. To publicly agree to remove them in a quid pro quo would shatter the credibility of the alliance. The French, the British, the West Germans, they would all conclude that American security guarantees were worthless, that their own cities were merely bargaining chips to be traded away to save American ones. It would be a political catastrophe, an admission of weakness that would make the Bay of Pigs look like a minor inconvenience. And so, the deal had to be a secret. It had to be laundered, buried, and denied. Uncomfortable, quote, a reconstruction of Robert Kennedy's words to Anatoly Dobrynin during their secret meeting on the night of October 27, 1962, based on both men's memoirs. Anatoly, the president cannot make this a public trade. If he announces a deal to remove the Jupiters, the political damage here and with our allies will be insurmountable. It will look like a surrender. But I can give you his personal assurance, word of honor from the President of the United States, that the missiles in Turkey will be gone. They are obsolete anyway. We were already planning to remove them. It will happen quietly, 4 or 5 months from now after this is all over. It will not be part of any public statement. There can be no linkage, no mention of it in any letters. Your side withdraws the missiles from Cuba in exchange for our public pledge not to invade. That is the deal the world will see. The other part of the deal is between your chairman and my brother. A private understanding, a gentleman's agreement. But you must understand, if you ever reveal this secret part of the arrangement, the deal is off, and the consequences will be unimaginable. And that was it. That was the secret that ended the crisis. The public resolution announced on October 28th was a triumph of American strength. The world heard that Khrushchev had blinked. The Soviet ships approaching the quarantine line had turned back. The missiles would be dismantled under UN supervision. In exchange, the United States had offered a simple pledge not to invade Cuba. Kennedy was hailed as a global statesman, a hero who had combined strength and restraint to pull the world back from the brink. The myth was cemented, The long-term consequence was the creation of a dangerously flawed model for crisis management. The lesson that American policymakers took from Cuba was not that provocation leads to escalation, or that secret diplomacy is essential. The lesson they learned was that brinkmanship works. If you push the other side to the very edge of the abyss, they will eventually back down. The secret of the missile trade was kept for decades, allowing this false macho narrative to become gospel. It taught a generation of leaders that making concessions was a sign of weakness, and that public posturing was more important than private reality. The world had been saved not by a public show of force, but by a secret, pragmatic, and politically necessary lie. The secret deal was struck. The world was told a story of a Soviet capitulation in the face of American resolve. The Kennedy administration emerged from the crisis wrapped in a mantle of legend. They were the brilliant knights of a new Camelot, the masters of the game who had looked into the abyss and not flinched. The story of XCOM became a case study in effective governance, taught in business schools and war colleges, as the pinnacle of rational, cool-headed crisis management. It was a comforting myth, a bedtime story for a nuclear age, reassuring the world that when the moment of ultimate peril arrived, our leaders were up to the task. This entire edifice of competence and control is a lie. We know it is a lie because of a secret John F. Kennedy kept from everyone in the room but himself. He was taping everything. A clandestine recording system installed in the cabinet room captured the raw, unfiltered reality of those 13 days. And the tapes do not reveal a room full of strategists. They reveal a room full of terrified, exhausted, and dangerously fallible men, guessing, gambling, and improvising their way through a crisis they had unleashed, but could no longer control. Listening to the Kennedy tapes is like reading the black box recording from a plane that has narrowly avoided a crash. The dominant sound is not one of confidence. It is the friction of frayed nerves and the hum of barely suppressed panic. The men of XCOM were operating on a handful of hours of sleep, fueled by caffeine and adrenaline, under a level of psychological pressure that no human being is equipped to handle. They made mistakes. They contradicted themselves. They fixated on irrelevant details while missing crucial ones. The public image was one of unity behind the president. The private reality was a chaotic swirl of terrible advice, second-guessing, and open dissent. The most terrifying pressure came from the uniformed men at the table. The Joint Chiefs of Staff, almost to a man, saw the quarantine as a weak, cowardly act of appeasement. They wanted war. Their solution was simple, clean, and absolute: a massive surprise airstrike to obliterate the missile sites, followed by a full-scale invasion of Cuba. General Curtis LeMay, the cigar-chewing, granite-faced head of the Air Force, the man who had firebombed Tokyo, was openly contemptuous of the president. He compared the blockade to the appeasement of Hitler at Munich. When Kennedy pressed him on what the Soviet reaction to an airstrike would be, LeMay scoffed. He assured the president they would do nothing. "This is a great moment in our history," another general is heard to say, his voice thick with anticipation. "The time has come for action." These were not advisors offering options. They were advocates for Armageddon, pushing the president relentlessly toward a military solution whose consequences they refused to seriously contemplate. The crisis reached its absolute nadir on Saturday, October 27th, a day that would go down in the secret history of the crisis as Black Saturday. It was the day everything fell apart, the day the leaders lost control of events on the ground. First, a U-2 spy plane, flown by Major Rudolph Anderson, was shot down over Cuba by a Soviet surface-to-air missile. The Hawks in XCOM erupted. The Soviets had drawn first blood. An American pilot was dead. The pressure on Kennedy to retaliate, to authorize a strike against the SAM sites as he had previously promised, was almost unbearable. He held off, but only just. Then, a few hours later, an even more terrifying report landed on his desk. Another U-2 on a routine air sampling mission over the North Pole had become disoriented and accidentally strayed hundreds of miles into Soviet airspace over the Chukchi Peninsula in Siberia. Soviet MiG fighters had scrambled to intercept it. In response, American F-102 fighters, armed with nuclear-tipped air-to-air missiles, had taken off from Alaska to protect the U-2. For a few heart-stopping minutes, a dogfight with nuclear implications was a distinct possibility over the frozen roof of the world. Kennedy's reaction on the tapes is one of weary, black humor and disbelief. There is always some son of a bitch who doesn't get the word. Uncomfortable. Quote, from the private journal of a junior National Security Council aide, dated October 27, 1962. The atmosphere in the outer offices is no longer tense, it is funereal. We are just typists for the apocalypse. The men who walk out of the cabinet room don't look like leaders anymore. They look like prisoners on death row waiting for the governor's call. The Secretary of Defense, a man who lives by numbers and probabilities, was ashen-faced. He said he believed he would not live to see another Saturday. The generals are still talking about surgical strikes, but everyone else seems to understand there is no such thing. The president is the only one who seems to be holding it together, but it's the composure of a man who knows he is out of moves. We are not managing a crisis. We are passengers on a bus whose driver has had a heart attack, and we are careening toward a cliff. We are all just hoping someone finds the brake before we go over the edge. This was the reality of XCOM. It was not a seminar on game theory. It was a street fight in a dark alley against an opponent they couldn't see, with the fate of the world at stake. The famous decision to ignore Khrushchev's second, harder line letter and respond only to the first, more conciliatory one was not a brilliant pre-planned strategy. It was a desperate suggestion made by Robert Kennedy late on Saturday night, when all other options seemed to be leading to war. It was a lawyer's trick, an act of procedural improvisation to keep a dying conversation alive for a few more hours. The long-term consequence of burying this chaotic reality beneath the heroic myth was profoundly dangerous. It created a false belief in the concept of crisis management. The idea that the sheer intellectual firepower of brilliant men can control the uncontrollable variables of war, chance, and human error. It taught future generations of leaders that the brink is a manageable place, a stage upon which greatness can be performed. The truth of the tapes is far more terrifying. They show that when the moment came, nobody was truly in control. The world did not survive because of their genius. It survived because of their dumb, terrified, and ultimately desperate luck. The myth of XCOM, the fiction of the brilliant men in control, survived because of luck. But we now know that on the most dangerous day of the crisis, Black Saturday, the fate of the world did not rest in the hands of the President of the United States or the Premier of the Soviet Union. It rested in the sweaty, cramped, oxygen-deprived control room of a single Soviet submarine, lost beneath the waves of the Sargasso Sea. And it was saved not by a calculated act of statecraft, but by the moral courage of one man who has been almost completely erased from the official story, a man whose name should be taught to every schoolchild on the planet, Vasily Arkhipov. While the men in XCOM were listening to tapes and debating ultimatums, a deadly, silent hunt was taking place along the quarantine line. The U.S. Navy was engaged in a massive anti-submarine warfare operation, tracking every Soviet vessel in the region. One of those vessels was a group of 4 Foxtrot-class diesel-electric submarines sent to escort the cargo ships to Cuba. These were not the nuclear-powered behemoths of later years. They were cramped, aging boats designed for the cold waters of the Arctic, and they were suffocating in the tropical heat of the Caribbean. Aboard one of them, submarine B-59, the situation had deteriorated into a living hell. The air conditioning had failed. The temperature inside the boat soared past 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Carbon dioxide levels were dangerously high. The crew, running on fumes, hadn't had contact with Moscow for days. They were alone, blind, and submerged in hostile waters, completely unaware if the war they had been sent to fight had already started. Then the explosions began. A fleet of 11 U.S. Navy destroyers and an aircraft carrier had cornered B-59. To force it to the surface, the destroyers began dropping practice depth charges. In the Pentagon, this was seen as a standard, non-lethal signaling procedure, a way of knocking on the door. But inside the steel hull of B-59, there is no such thing as a practice explosion. A depth charge is a depth charge. The submarine was being rocked by concussions. The lights flickered. The crew was thrown about. Their captain, a volatile but respected officer named Valentin Savitsky, came to the only logical conclusion a man in his position could. World War III had begun. They were under attack and they were going to die. But they were not going to die without fighting back, because B-59 had a secret weapon, a weapon the Americans had no idea was there. It was a single torpedo with a 10-kiloton nuclear warhead, with roughly the same destructive power as the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. Savitsky had his orders. If attacked, if his communication with Moscow was severed, he was authorized to use his special weapon. Believing his boat was being torn apart, he turned to his officers and gave the order. Arm the nuclear torpedo. We will fire. The political officer on board, Ivan Maslenikov, gave his consent. The procedure for launching the nuclear weapon required the unanimous agreement of the 3 senior officers on board. 2 had now said yes. The fate of every city on the U.S. eastern seaboard, and likely the world, hung on the decision of the 3rd man. That man was Vasily Arkhipov. Arkhipov was not a member of B-59's crew. He was the flotilla commander for the entire submarine group, and he just happened to be using B-59 as his command vessel. This accident of posting made him equal in rank to Captain Savitsky. It was this fluke of the command structure that saved the world. Classified memo. After action report. U.S. Navy Task Group Alpha, November 1962. Restricted. Subject: analysis of ASW signaling procedures during the Cuban quarantine. The successful enforcement of the quarantine line and the surfacing of Soviet submarine B-59 without loss of life is considered a tactical victory. However, subsequent intelligence has raised grave concerns about the signaling protocols employed. We were operating under the assumption that the use of low-yield practice depth charges was a universally understood signal to surface. It is now clear this assumption was not shared by the Soviet Naval Command. We were, in effect, communicating in a language the recipient did not understand, and which they interpreted as a direct, lethal assault. We were knocking on a door with a sledgehammer, entirely unaware that the man on the other side of the door was holding the detonator for a suicide bomb. The fact that the situation did not escalate is attributable not to the success of our procedures, but to factors entirely outside our control, specifically, the internal command dynamics of the Soviet vessel. We were dancing on the edge of a volcano and calling it a training exercise. Future protocols must assume a worst-case interpretation of any concussive force used against a submerged, nuclear-capable adversary. We were not in control of this engagement. It is vital we never again pretend that we are. Arkhipov said no. In the sweltering claustrophobic control room, surrounded by panicked men and the deafening clang of explosions, he was the one voice of calm. He argued with Savitsky, who was reportedly screaming that they would blast them now, and that he would die but sink them all. Arkhipov reasoned that if a real war had started, they would be getting continuous signals from Moscow, not radio silence. He insisted that the explosions were signals, not attacks, meant to force them to surface. He stood his ground. He refused to give his consent. He vetoed the launch of a nuclear weapon. A furious argument ensued, but Archipov's unique rank and calm demeanor prevailed. He talked the captain down from the ledge of Armageddon. B-59 surfaced, in the midst of the American fleet, its crew exhausted and bewildered, but alive. The long-term consequence of this event is its most chilling aspect, its absence from the story. For 40 years, the world did not know how close it had come, or who had saved it. The heroic narrative of Kennedy, the crisis manager, could not survive the revelation that the world was actually preserved by a forgotten Soviet naval officer in a submerged metal tube who simply refused to start a war. The story of Vasily Arkhipov reveals the ultimate, terrifying truth of the crisis, that it was not managed at all. It was survived by the thinnest of margins, thanks to the character of a man whose name the leaders of the world would never even learn. The story of Vasily Arkhipov is the story of a ghost, the invisible man who held the world in his hands and then quietly handed it back, his service unknown and unrewarded. As the terrifying details of Black Saturday and the close calls on the quarantine line slowly, secretly, filtered back to the leaders in Washington and Moscow, a chilling realization set in. They had not been in command. They had been passengers clinging to the rails of a ship in a hurricane, saved not by their own seamanship, but by a random break in the storm. The crisis had revealed a fundamental, terrifying flaw in the architecture of the Cold War. The two men with the power to destroy the world had no reliable way to speak to each other in the moment of ultimate peril. Messages took hours to be transmitted, encoded, translated, and delivered. In a crisis that was unfolding in minutes, this was an eternity. In the immediate aftermath, the public was sold a story of profound lessons learned. The world, having stared into the nuclear abyss, had stepped back, chastened and wiser. The proof of this newfound wisdom, the great symbol of the post-crisis thaw, was unveiled on June 20th, 1963. It was the Memorandum of Understanding regarding the establishment of a direct communications link. The press, with its love of simple, powerful images, immediately dubbed it the hotline, and in the public imagination, a powerful myth was born. A bright red telephone sitting on the president's desk in the Oval Office, a direct line to his counterpart in the Kremlin. In the event of another crisis, they could simply pick it up, talk leader to leader, and avoid the misunderstandings that had brought them so close to the brink. It was presented as a triumph of reason, a tool for peace, an olive branch woven from a transatlantic cable. This image is a complete fiction. There was no red telephone. The hotline was not even a telephone at all. It was a teletype machine, a clunky, noisy, glorified typewriter that sent printed messages back and forth. In the early days, it was so slow and primitive that it used the Latin alphabet for Russian messages, which then had to be transliterated. More importantly, the purpose of the hotline was not what the public was told it was. Its primary function was not to prevent war. Its function was to more efficiently manage the brink of war. It was the ultimate cynical admission that the game of nuclear chicken was going to continue, and the players simply needed a better way to signal to each other as they floored the accelerator, heading for the next collision. Having just survived a crisis born of their own relentless provocations, from Operation Mongoose to the Jupiter missiles in Turkey, the leaders in Washington and Moscow did not conclude that they should stop provoking each other. They concluded that they needed a better emergency brake for when their provocations inevitably spiraled out of control. The hotline was not an instrument of peace, it was an instrument of crisis management. It was a tool designed to make brinkmanship safer. It was the equivalent of two rival gang leaders agreeing to wear bulletproof vests to their next shootout. It doesn't stop the violence, it just marginally increases the odds of personal survival. Classified memo. From a senior Pentagon strategic planner to the Secretary of Defense, early 1963. Subject: on the strategic utility of the Direct Communications Link, DCL. The State Department will frame this as a diplomatic breakthrough, a step toward de-escalation. We should view it through a different lens. The DCL is not a substitute for strategic superiority. It is a component of it. The last crisis demonstrated that the most dangerous variable is the fog of war, the lag in communication that allows for miscalculation and unintended escalation. The DCL mitigates that variable. It allows the president to apply maximum pressure, to take a crisis to the very edge, with a higher degree of confidence that his final ultimatum will be clearly and instantly understood by his adversary. It is a tool for clarifying threats, not for eliminating them. It allows us to play the game closer to the line because we now have a direct line to the referee. In a sense, it does not make the world safer. It makes it safe enough for us to continue pursuing our strategic objectives by more dangerous means. The long-term consequence of the hotline was the institutionalization of a state of permanent, manageable crisis. It created a profound and dangerous illusion of control. It allowed the superpowers to continue their proxy wars in Vietnam, the Middle East, and Africa, to continue their relentless arms race, to continue their covert espionage and sabotage, all under the comforting assumption that if things went too far, a quick teletype message could pull it all back from the brink. It normalized the insane logic of mutually assured destruction by providing a user interface for it. It was the ultimate technocratic solution to a problem of human aggression and paranoia. It didn't address the disease, it just offered a more sophisticated way to monitor the patient's vital signs as he slowly poisoned himself, The lesson learned from Cuba was not never do this again. It was next time, do it with a teletype. The hotline was not the end of the crisis. It was the beginning of the next one, and the one after that, a piece of hardware that would enable a new, more stable, but no less terrifying generation of Cold War confrontation. The world exhaled on October 28, 1962. A collective, shuddering sigh of relief rippled across the planet. The fever had broken. The Soviet ships had turned back. The missiles were being crated up and sent home. Kennedy was the hero, Khrushchev the chastened gambler. The story had a clean ending, a Hollywood climax where the good guys win and the world is saved. But the Cuban Missile Crisis did not end. It simply went subcutaneous. It metastasized from an acute, terrifying crisis into a chronic, low-grade, and permanent condition of global existence. The crisis was not a fever that broke. It was a virus that integrated itself into the DNA of the international system, creating a new, monstrously stable form of life. A world living on a knife edge, forever. The immediate aftermath was a flurry of activity that looked, on the surface, like progress. In August 1963, the US, UK, and USSR signed the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, prohibiting nuclear weapons tests in the atmosphere, in outer space, and underwater. It was hailed as the great lesson of the crisis, a testament to the newfound sobriety of the superpowers. The world would no longer be poisoned by radioactive fallout from the superpowers' open-air experiments. This was, of course, a public relations exercise, an act of environmental hygiene that did absolutely nothing to address the core disease. The treaty was a gentleman's agreement to take the bomb-making into the basement. It drove testing underground, where it continued furiously for decades. More importantly, it did nothing to stop the one thing that truly mattered: the production and deployment of the missiles themselves. The arms race didn't slow down, it accelerated. Having been humiliated by America's overwhelming conventional and strategic superiority during the crisis, the Soviets embarked on a crash program to achieve nuclear parity at any cost. The Kennedy administration, for its part, continued the massive buildup it had started, deploying over 1,000 Minuteman ICBMs in hardened silos across the American Midwest. The crisis had not taught them to disarm. It had taught them to arm smarter, faster, and bigger. This was the true legacy of those 13 days. The crisis never ended because it had been a spectacular success for the very systems it was supposed to call into question. For the military-industrial complex, it was the ultimate justification for every budget request, every new weapon system. For the intelligence agencies, it was proof that the world was a chessboard of infinite, hidden threats that required a permanent, global apparatus of surveillance and covert action. For the political leaders, it provided the ultimate political trump card, the invocation of national security to justify any action, any expenditure, any secret. The crisis institutionalized a state of permanent paranoia. It created a world where the abnormal became the new normal, a world where school children practiced duck and cover drills, where families built fallout shelters in their backyards, where a significant portion of the national treasure was poured into building machines whose only purpose was to end human history in 30 minutes. Uncomfortable. Quote, from a strategic paper circulated within the Rand Corporation, 1964. Subject, the post-Cuba strategic environment, a new paradigm of stability. The 1962 crisis should not be viewed as a failure of the system, but as its first successful full-scale stress test. It demonstrated that the logic of nuclear deterrence, while terrifying, is fundamentally sound. Both sides were pushed to the brink of the unthinkable, and both chose to step back. We have now moved beyond the primitive phase of mere atomic possession into a more mature era of managed nuclear confrontation. The key takeaway is the need for enhanced command and control, flexible response options, and clear signaling, the DCL being the primary example. This allows us to leverage our strategic superiority in regional sub-crises, such as Southeast Asia, with a much lower risk of unintended escalation to a general nuclear war. The world has not become safer in the classic sense. Rather, the danger has become quantifiable, predictable, and therefore, manageable. Paradoxically, the very terror of the brink allows for a more aggressive, forward-leaning policy in the periphery. Stability is not the absence of conflict. It is the perfect calibration of terror. And that periphery is where the cost of this new stability was paid in blood. The great unspoken agreement that emerged from Cuba was that the superpowers would never again directly confront each other. Instead, they would fight their wars by proxy, using the bodies of Vietnamese, Angolans, Afghans, and Nicaraguans as the chess pieces in their great game. The jungles and deserts of the Third World became the designated pressure release valves for the Cold War, the places where the conflict could burn hot because the risk to Moscow and Washington was low. This was the true price of the peace that was supposedly secured in October 1962. Millions would die over the next 30 years to preserve the stability that the crisis had created. The entire global apparatus of surveillance, mistrust, and covert warfare that defines our world to this day was not created by the Cold War. It was perfected and made permanent by the Cuban Missile Crisis. It was the moment that humanity, having survived its near-death experience, chose not to change its ways, but to simply learn to live with the disease, convincing itself that the constant low-grade fever of paranoia was the price of survival. The crisis never ended. We are all still living in its long, dark shadow. So, was it all a lie? The short answer is yes, but not in the way you might think. The bombs were real, the spies were real, the terror was real. The lie was in the telling. The lie was the clean narrative of good versus evil, of wise leaders and clear motives, of a struggle that had a neat beginning and a triumphant end. The reality was a chaotic, cynical, and often pathetic scramble for power by flawed men who were as much prisoners of the systems they created as they were its masters. This history wasn't a grand chess match. It was a knife fight in a dark room, full of accidents, betrayals, and dumb luck. Our goal here in this sleepless dossier is not to replace the official story with a new conspiracy. It is to remind you that the tidy narratives they sell us are almost never the full picture. The truth is always in the messy details, the classified memos, and the uncomfortable quotes they hoped you would never hear. And that's the truth they tried to bury. Until next time, always question the official story.